Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Integrated Resource Planning Workshop on the Reliable and Clean Power Procurement Program staff proposal. I'm Nathan Barczyk, Acting Program Manager for the Electricity Planning and Market Design Branch at CPUC's Energy Division. Next slide, I'll give a quick intro, kind of level setting of where we're at. We're going to spend some time this morning and into the early afternoon talking about one of the, in my opinion, biggest proposals that has come out of IRP. We've issued some big things before and taken some significant actions at commission level. But if this program is maybe what it could be, it's very possible that what gets eventually adopted could drive a very large amount of the procurement that is needed to get to our SB 100 2045 goals. The path to get here has been long. So a lot of people focus on a Q4 2020 staff paper that we issued that started discussing, kind of orienting people to some of the concepts that are in play here. But in my opinion, this started back in the spring of 2017 with a staff proposal that we issued then regarding implementation of IRP at the CPUC, where we first described, what is now known as the planning track. So what IRP planning could look like. But there are some key concepts, and to me, kind of the toughest nuts to crack were how do you connect that planning process that we were confident that we could stand up and make successful into procurement, and not just procurement, but procurement that we needed, that would meet our goals, and that was least cost. And that's the key question that RCPPP is trying to tackle. Most of you in a more kind of proximate sense would say the most recent thing or biggest thing that you've interacted with in terms of RCPPP development is actually the September 2022 options paper, and you wouldn't be wrong. We did cover a lot of material there, and we got a lot of really good thinking from stakeholders back in the months afterwards in comments and replies that we've been spending a lot of time noodling on, trying to figure out what's the next form that this should take, and what are the best ideas that we can put forward to have stakeholders react to. Thanks for all of your input so far, and thanks to those of you that usually in good nature would needle us a bit and say, hey, when is the RCPPP proposal coming out? Well, we're standing here more than 2.5 years onwards saying that we're here. At the end of April, we issued a staff proposal. We look forward to covering it with you for the next 3-4 hours. As I alluded to before, we understand the scale of what's going on here and how big this proposal is. Thanks to you that have already provided input, and thanks for your ongoing engagement, because we are by no means done. So the next slide, the purpose of today. This is really focused on what we issued on the 29th. The ruling had, well, there's a package of information associated with the ruling. So it's the ruling itself. Attachment A is the staff proposal. Attachment B is the slide deck summary of the staff proposal, which focuses in on some of the more technical concepts in particular. Attachment C is summary of comments from the 2022 staff options paper to help refresh memories and kind of reorient people to where we are. The purpose of today is really twofold. First, to familiarize the stakeholder community with the RCPPP staff proposal, and second, and maybe more importantly, to provide an opportunity for stakeholders to ask clarifying questions, which hopefully can inform formal written comments. And those of you that have been paying attention to the docket would know that a couple of days ago, ALJ Julie Fitch in the IRP proceeding granted a request for an extension for comments and replies, which are now due July 15th and August 5th, respectively. On the next slide, we'll go into a little bit of logistics. So workshop slides and other material is available on the RCPPP website, which is linked here. It is part of the IRP website if you want to navigate to it that way. Reminder for those that didn't just hear it, but this workshop is being recorded. And so all things related to this workshop, including that recording, the Q&A transcript, which we'll get to in a second, slides, and any other materials will be posted on this webpage. The next slide, I'll do my usual caveat and kind of delineation about clarifying questions versus advocacy. So if the main point of today is to promote everyone's understanding of the proposal, the critical path to that is getting good clarifying questions into this conversation. And that is to say, please, clarifying questions and not advocacy. Advocacy is statement of positions, trying to push the conversation in one way or another. We understand that that has an important role It's just that the time for that comes a little bit later. That's mainly in comments and replies. What we need today is for everyone's questions to get into the conversation and hopefully answered, which we'll do our darndest to accomplish. We've also relatedly heard stakeholders formally and informally ask for not just more time, but more stakeholder activity, workshop activity. We're going to use this workshop to feel out where we are on that. What you'll notice when we get to the agenda in a minute is that at the end of this workshop, we do have a section kind of set aside for, we're calling it verbal Q&A, but just a little bit looser conversation around some other maybe process topics and more ephemeral things that might be hard to get in the Q&A function itself, where we can raise this again. So we hear you and we're trying to be responsive. For the main part of the workshop, though, we're going to be using the Q&A functionality that you've grown really used to in the WebEx. So if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A feature so we can produce a written record. To get to the Q&A, you're going to look in the WebEx window. You're going to look in the very bottom right and find a button that has find a button that has 3 horizontal dots on it. Once you hit that, you'll get a quick drop down and you should see Q&A in there. You should hit that, and then you should be able to type in your question. It should be defaulted for your question to go to all panelists, but if you don't see that, there should be a drop down which allows you to toggle all panelists as the recipients. Staff and consultants will then work to answer your question while we're mid-workshop. After the workshop, we're going to clean up the Q&A and post it online for reference. It is possible that we refine the Q&A a bit in some places, either for formatting and clarity, or sometimes inconsistencies or even inaccuracies. If we gave you a bad answer, it's possible that we might fix that, and we'll try to note that if it happens in the final transcript that we post, hopefully a few days from now. If we don't get to your question during the WebEx, we will by the time that we post the transcript. And a reminder that the written Q&A is not formal record in the proceeding. So when in doubt, particularly for things that will inform your comments and other things that you might put formally in the record, please revert back to what's in the official record as more authoritative, as the Q&A doc, again, is not formal record. For those of you that submitted questions ahead of time, we thank you a lot for that. It helped inform some of the places in the presentations we're about to do where we could go bigger or maybe clarify things a little bit better. If you want those questions answered in the webinar, please just submit them in the Q&A function. Reminder, please don't use the chat function. I know it's sitting right there in the lower right too. It's easy to confuse with the Q&A function, but please don't use chat. Please click the button with the 3 horizontal dots on it to get to the Q&A. Now onto the agenda. There's a pretty big group of us that have worked on various parts of the proposal to get us here, and a bunch of them are on the panel. So up here with me are Sina Sufiani, a utilities engineer and the project manager for RCPPP. Sarah Withers, also utilities engineer and project coordinator for RCPPP. Molly Sturkle, acting director for the Office of Electric Supply, Planning and Costs in CPUC's Energy Division. Neil Raffin, supervisor for IRP's transmission and interconnection section, and until not that long ago, the lead for RCPPP. Jamie Gannon, the supervisor for the resource adequacy section, may be here, as well as her colleague Zoe Draghi, an analyst on RA. Sheila Lee, an analyst on IRP. Alex Mannheimer, an analyst on IRP. Christian Knierim, an analyst from RPS. And ALJ Julie Fitch, definitely last but not least. We also have consultant from E3, Aaron Burdick. Not all of us will be presenting. You can see that here in the agenda, but we'll all be here working very diligently to try to get your questions answered. Now, you'll probably notice that the agenda is roughly structured how the paper is structured. In a few minutes, I'll be done, and Sina will go into both background and objectives and an RCPPP overview. We'll then go into the 2 broad components that you find in the paper of what we propose for the program. The first is reliability procurement. So Aaron will go into some of the more technical details associated with marginal ELCCs, critical periods framework. And then Sina will go through need determination, allocation, compliance and enforcement, and then a summary of the reliability portion of the program. We'll then take a quick break to give everyone a bit of a breather and come back, and Sierra will reorient us on the GHG reduction procurement and things associated with need determination, need allocation, compliance and enforcement there. We'll then do a quick next steps, just a level set of where we are and what's coming up. And then we'll get into the verbal question section that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and we'll prompt you then for how to interact during that part of the session. I think that's it. I would like to get out of the way and get us kicked off on the real meat of what we're going to be covering today. So with that, I think I can hand over to Sina.
Thanks, Nathan. Hi, everyone. I'm Sina Sufiani. I'm a professional engineer on the IRP staff. And as Nathan said, the project manager for the development of this staff proposal. I'm very happy to meet you all and be here with you all today. I will be walking us through a good portion of this presentation, first by giving some general background on procurement in IRP, followed by a high-level overview of the staff proposal, and then going into some greater detail on the reliability portion of RCPPP. Next slide, please. Okay, so first some regulatory context of how the CPUC regulates the electricity market in California, which I'm sure we're all familiar with here, but briefly, we have the Resource Adequacy Program, which requires contracting for system reliability, local reliability, and so on for the near term. We have the Integrated Resource Planning process, which ensures that load-serving entities meet targets that allow the electric sector to contribute to California's economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction goals at least cost and while maintaining reliability. And we have the RPS program, which requires LSCs to procure a minimum portion of their load from eligible renewable resources. And of course, we do have some demand-side proceedings as well. Over recent years, there have been some changes to the market. We've had increased market fragmentation, so CCA serving a larger portion of load than before. We've got increased capacity market tightness, so power plants are aging and retiring across the country. And we've got increasingly ambitious emissions reduction goals through various pieces of legislation that have been passed in recent years. And so what you'll see in this program is that we've designed it to try to meet both emissions reduction goals and reliability. Next slide, please. So first, some procurement background. The turning point was really in 2019, where we had our first procurement order. Before 2019, we generally got new resources through orders to IOUs or renewable energy contracting to comply with the RPS program. However, since 2019, we have had what we call an order-by-order approach to procurement, which is basically point-in-time, one-off individual procurement orders for the load-serving entities that the CPUC regulates. These are the three decisions down here that we talk about when we say order by order. The first one was in 2019, which ordered 3,300 megawatts of capacity. And then the big one was the MTR decision in 2021, which ordered 11,500 megawatts. And then D23 was the supplemental MTR decision, which ordered an additional 4,000 megawatts. So although this order by order approach to procurement has worked pretty well today, there are some challenges to this approach. First, and importantly, it can be kind of unpredictable for LSCs. We don't know when these orders are going to come until we have to do one. So it is fairly unpredictable to a degree. It doesn't have a good way of reallocating requirements to load if there's load migration. It does not reward or facilitate LSCs self-provision of needed resource attributes, and also doesn't really address existing resource retention. And so those are kind of the main challenges, but some other ones are also that our order by order procurement, the IRP orders largely end after 2028. It's been kind of difficult to track procurement, and bridging can be a cumbersome process. And of course, backstop for deficient LSCs has a long lag time. Next slide, please. Okay, so brief history of RCPPP development, which Nathan alluded to briefly. In 2020, we issued a staff proposal that discussed procurement in the context of IRP, but it did not really give any specific recommendations or options for what a programmatic approach to procurement would look like. However, in September 22, we did release a staff options paper, which was kind of the first proposal that did investigate what various options would look like to create a procurement program and IRP. So fast forward to today, we have released the current staff proposal, which is the most recent evolution of this process. The RCPPP staff proposal contains both, again, reliability and greenhouse gas emissions portions of it, and it is really influenced based on the record that we got from the staff options paper back in September 2022. So this is the most recent evolution from the options paper. And as Nathan said, in Judge Fitch's ruling, attachment C to the ruling, we did prepare a summary of party comments because we know it's been a few years now, so we wanted to provide everybody a refresher on the comments that were submitted to the options paper. And so this staff proposal has been developed in recognition of some of the, the challenges to order by order procurement that we discussed a few slides prior. Next slide, please. So here's just kind of a timeline overview. It's a good graphic that I like. You see the first decision in 2019 that established the procurement track within IRP. And you see the various order by order decisions here. So D19, D21, D23, those are the procurement orders that we discussed previously. And then you also see the initial papers that we've released, the one back in 2020 and the one in 2022, which is the options paper. And then fast forward to today, we have released the staff proposal on April 29th of this year. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to do a kind of a high-level overview of RCPPP, kind of like a executive summary, if you will, just give you a quick elevator pitch of what this is. Next slide, please. So the overall goal of RCPPP basically is we want to create a procurement framework that, when combined with the RA and RPS programs, it basically gives LSCs a tool to procure their share of reliability resources and GHG reduction resources at least cost. So we're basically integrating reliability and emissions reductions into one program. For reliability, the staff proposal gives two options. Both of those options have explicit linkages to the RA program to varying degrees, and they give LSCs a more predictable pathway to procure resources to meet reliability purposes. The GHG reduction portion of the program, we do present one option, and that option is the Clean Energy Standard. The Clean Energy Standard was discussed in the staff options paper in 2022. So based on feedback from that paper, we did build that further into this current staff proposal. It is basically modeled off the RPS program, and it's intended to give LSCs a more predictable pathway to procure resources to meet emissions reduction goals. So both portions of this program of RCPPP are intended to go hand in hand. So you get resources for reliability purposes and for achieving clean energy goals. RCPPP would apply to all LSCs under the CPUC's jurisdiction. So the investor-owned utilities, community choice aggregators, and energy service providers within the CAISO, but it will not apply to small and multi-jurisdictional IOUs outside the CAISO, and it would not apply to publicly owned utilities. Of course, RCPPP is consistent with statutory requirements. If you want to look at Section 2 of the proposal, we do have a kind of a brief analysis there of RCPPP complying with statute and how it is actually stems from certain statutes that have been passed over the years. And excuse me, since this is a program, it would it would begin once MTR orders roll off around 2028. So here, these are kind of the 5 program design principles that we design RCPPP on. So 1, we want the program to be effective. So it's going to support maintenance of existing resources and adding new clean resources. We want it to support affordability. We want it to be a fair program in the sense that LSCs are not unfairly discriminated across technology types or projects. We want this program to be easily administered. So it has to be feasibly administered for compliance and enforcement. And of course, the big one is predictability. really the main part of RCPPP is to support greater predictability for LSCs to achieve both reliability and emissions goals. And on the next slide, you'll see some of the common themes throughout the staff proposal for both the reliability portion of RCPPP and the GHG reduction portion of RCPPP. They're basically tailored around these 4 key themes, and these are also stemming from the initial staff options paper. So the first is need determination, in other words, technical analysis to specify the needed quantities of resource attributes, and need allocation, which is what quantities of those attributes should each LSC be required to procure. So you can think of need determination as the full pie of reliability and emissions goals, and need allocation is each LSC's portion or piece of that pie. And of course, once we assign each LSC's allocation, we have to measure compliance and engage in enforcement if needed. So again, those are the common themes for both the reliability and GHG portions of the proposal. And on the next slide, you'll see how this interacts with the IRP planning track. So of course, there are 3 tracks within IRP. We've got the planning track, the transmission and interconnection section, and the procurement section. So this is a procurement program, and it is going to interact with the IRP planning track, basically by drawing from the findings from the planning track on a regular basis. So you can see here, we'll get from the planning track various reliability and GHG metrics that will inform the procurement that's done under RCPPP, and RCPPP in turn will be basically an update to baselines in procurement track and informing inputs and assumptions in the procurement track. And of course, this is a evolution from the order by order approach, but of course the commission does still have the authority to exercise procurement orders as needed if we do have certain resource specific need that's found. And on the next slide, you'll see kind of a different depiction of this. So you have the planning track, which issues a portfolio or transmits a portfolio to the CAISO. And every few years we adopt a preferred system plan, right? So in RCPPP, we would basically use an adopted portfolio from the planning track and use that to do our RCPPP procurement obligations. You'll see later on in this slide deck and in the proposal that we have December and June compliance filings. So the need allocation that LSCs get in the reliability portion of the program is based on an adopted IRP portfolio, and based on that portfolio and the procurement obligations that LSCs get in RCPPP, we will measure compliance every June and December of each RCPPP year. And of course, some related processes here, which we won't go into necessarily here, are the CEC's IPER, RA filings, and various filings in the RPS program. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so from here, we are going to discuss, if you can go to the next slide, Alex. Basically, we're going to do a little bit of educational framework on marginal ELCCs and the critical periods framework, which is a common theme throughout the reliability options in the staff proposal. So on the next slide, you'll see why we chose basically a balance of marginal ELCCs and slice of day for the various options in this program. In the 2022 options paper, we did present different approaches to reliability procurement, including marginal ELCCs, average ELCCs, slice of day, firm energy accounting, et cetera. But our current staff proposal, basically, we provide 2 options that both use marginal ELCCs for determining and allocating IRP-related need, and also those programs, as I said earlier, are linked to or coexist with the RA slice of day program to varying degrees, and we'll get into those differences later on in this slide deck. But overall, we chose marginal ELCCs for portions of these reliability options because they're, number one, effective in signaling the resources that are needed to meet specified LOLE. They are aligned with principles of economic efficiency because they value resources based on their marginal value to the market. and they are already used for new procurement within IRP and RPS. So we are familiar with these, what marginal ELCs do related to IRP and RPS. So I know there was a question earlier of, will we go through the differences from this deck versus what was released before? This is an example of that. This is really just the background education on marginal ELCCs. So this is not a change to the staff proposal. This is just going to provide stakeholders with some background information on marginal ELCCs. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Aaron Burdick from E3 to talk about marginal ELCCs and critical periods framework.
Great, thank you, Sina. Good morning, everyone. So some of this material will actually seem familiar to folks who have been following the planning track. It's similar to the approach that we used for the 2022 LSE IRPs. So I'll be talking about how this approach to reliability planning fits into both IRP planning for the system, for LSEs, as well as it's proposed here for LSE procurement within RCPPP. So this slide in particular, we've presented a couple times in the proceeding, and I'd like to make a few points here about the benefits of an ELCC-based approach for resource accreditation. So as we see via these illustrative values on the right, no resource can provide perfect availability all of the time. And the ELCC methodology is a way to put all resources on a level playing field, measured relative to a perfect capacity generator that accounts for all of their potential availability limitations. So for wind and solar, that accounts for their variable nature and that correlation between their output with weather and load. For storage, hydro, and demand response, it accounts for use limitations and duration limitations. And for firm capacity like natural gas generators, it accounts for outage rates and or ambient D rates. So all resources can be put on a level playing field within this framework. And then one thing that is important to understand is that while ELCCs are rated as a percentage of nameplate capacity, the calculation that informs that percentage includes both capacity and energy constraints within the SERVA model. So the full factors that contribute to loss of load risk and the ability for resources to contribute to reducing that risk is accounted for, both energy and capacity constraints in ELCC calculations. Next slide, please. So here we're outlining the 4 key components of what we're now calling the critical periods framework. You'll see why we use that term shortly. And I'd like to start by noting that the first component here really is related to the IRP planning track, and specifically the resolve long-term capacity optimization. So the first step is to determine the total reliability need for the system. And what this means is using SERVUM to calculate the total ELCC megawatts that is needed to meet the 0.1 days per year LOLE standard. And that information is then provided to Resolve to ensure that it can build out sufficient resources to meet RA needs over the planning horizon. That is paired with ELCC curves and surfaces for resource contributions against that total need. And this value is not portfolio dependent. So we can define this durable definition of need and use that as a PRM for long-term planning. But then when we get into LSE planning and procurement, which is represented in steps 2 through 4, we are taking a system portfolio, and these values are portfolio dependent. So this next step is to determine the marginal ELCCs for each resource type from that portfolio over time. And this is equivalent to the expected performance of each resource type during what we call the critical periods. So these are the periods where the system faces reliability risk. Then we can determine the reliability procurement need. This is calculated as the sum of the marginal ELCCs for a portfolio that is tuned to the 0.1 standard. and it is also equivalent to the load and operating reserves that are served during those same critical periods. And then step 4 is to allocate that system need to each LSE, and that is done based on the LSE's expected load during those same critical periods. So there is consistency between the accreditation of resources, between the definition of the system need and the allocation of that system need using the same set of critical periods. And those critical periods are a function of the portfolio and will change over time. For step 4, I'll note there are 2 options proposed in RCPPP. Option 1 would allocate the share of all resources needed to meet the system need plus a buffer, whereas option 2 would allocate the share of new resources, which are defined as all resources minus those existing resources that are greater than 10 years old. Next slide, please. So if we take a step back and rewind the clock a couple decades, and we go back to a system that is focused primarily on firm dispatchable capacity, we can conceptualize how reliability planning logically works within that system. So what we see here is that in a system with firm capacity, the periods of risk align with the periods of highest load. So this is what we call the gross peak. You can see the top of that blue line representing the gross peak is aligned with the system critical hours when there is reliability risk. And we have limited interactions between resource types for firm capacity, and therefore it was sufficient to include the forced outage rates from those resources in the PRM above that gross peak as we define the need. Next slide, please. So now transitioning to the system that California has today and will increasingly have in the future, which is one based on a combination of firm capacity, renewables, battery storage, and other use-limited resources. What we see, particularly if you look at the events in 2020 and the near reliability events in 2022, what we see is that now the critical periods for reliability risk are no longer consistent with the gross load peak. They have shifted later into the day into what we now call the net peak. And that is due to renewables that have shifted that net load later in the day. And then it's also evolved as energy storage has been added to the system. And that storage charges earlier in the day and then discharges over an extended period in the evening. And so when we think about reliability planning for this type of system, we can see that the hours that matter for reliability risk have shifted, and we want an approach to reliability planning that will reflect the system need during those new critical hours. So that's exactly what marginal ELCC does. And in doing so, it provides the investment signal for market entry for the types of resources that we need to support reliability in the system that we have. Next slide, please. So the analytical method to do that is in step 1, we take the forecasted resource portfolio informed by historical LSE procurement and resources that come out of the IRP planning track, either from LSE plans or from resolve optimization. We put that into the SERVA model, and we use that SERVA model analysis to calculate the critical hours. So these are the periods when that portfolio in that year has reliability risk. Step 2 is to calculate the marginal ELCCs, which are the output from the resources on the system during those same critical hours. And so this is a marginal ELCC calculation. So we're removing a small slice of each resource type from that bigger portfolio, and we're calculating the equivalent marginal ELCC. And then in step 3, we take the sum of all of the marginally accredited resources and we add those together, and that gives us the reliability procurement need. and that is the sum of the marginal ELCC megawatts for a portfolio of resources that meets the 0.1 days per year standard. Next slide, please. So here's an example of that using some illustrative values. So you have the total reliability procurement need, and then you can see here just as a percentage of the stack of resources that contribute to that when they are accredited using marginal ELCC, how that shakes out. So these will be updated shortly, so I wouldn't get too tied to all of these numbers, but this is just an example of how that stack might look. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is another way of distinguishing how IRP planning for the system would work in Resolve versus how LSE planning and procurement would work within LSE IRPs and RCPPP. So on the left hand of this slide, we have the total reliability need. That's the first calculation that I noted a few slides earlier. And that's the total ELCC megawatts that the system needs to meet the 0.1 LOLE standard. That could be translated into a PCAP PRM. We described that a couple months ago in the INA workshop, showing a 14 to 15% PCAP PRM above the IPER peak. And then what Resolve sees is it sees the total portfolio ELCC need, that's defined as the peak plus the PRM. It sees the total ELCC from existing resources and from new resources that are added to the system. And that's done by using ELCC curves and surfaces. And then from those same curves and surfaces, we can take the derivative of them and calculate the marginal value of incremental additions across a broad range of portfolios. So what that enables Resolve to do is to look across a large solution space of resource portfolios and ensure that the portfolios that come out of the optimization are reliable. So then when we transition to LSE planning and procurement, we have to understand that within the California market, each LSE effectively functions as what I would call an ELCC taker, meaning that their procurement is small enough relative to the total system, at least in the near term, that we can use that system to come up with marginal ELCC values, and that those can guide their individual LSE procurements. And so what you see here on the right side is a lower total stack using the marginal ELCC for each resource type. And the difference between the portfolio ELCC and the sum of the marginal ELCCs we call portfolio effects. So this is a reduction in the megawatt procurement need relative to the total portfolio ELCC. And this reduction is shared amongst all LSEs. Then you see the procurement need in the red bar there. And we have noted the gross peak on the right side of that. And what you can see is that the procurement need may actually be lower than the gross peak. And this can potentially be confusing to folks because we're so used to historically measuring need based on this planning reserve margin concept. And of course, if you calculate that relative to a higher peak, that would result in a negative planning reserve margin. But we don't need a planning reserve margin anymore. Instead, within RCPPP, we would just directly calculate the reliability procurement need for a given system with a given load forecast and a given resource portfolio. And of course, the reason that the procurement need is lower than the gross peak is, as I noted earlier, the procurement need is defined based on the net peak now. And so as resources that shift that peak are added to the system, the net peak is going to be lower than the gross peak. Hence, this is an outcome that we would generally expect. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of how those numbers may evolve over time. This is using the marginal ELCC forecast from the 2022 filing requirements. So as I noted, this will be updated over the next couple of months for the current IRP cycle. So don't get too attached to the numbers. but this illustrates one of the key concepts, which is that the total reliability need is increasing over time as the peak is growing, while the reliability procurement need can actually reduce over time. And so you see that as the growing portfolio effects and the increasing green bars here for the total need and the decreasing red bars for the marginal reliability procurement need. And again, the reason for that is because the net peak is reducing over time as we're adding renewables and storage resources that are also having ELCC saturation. So as their ELCCs decline, those lower marginal ELCCs, reflective of that lower net peak, would form the basis for this reliability procurement need, which can reduce over time, even as we have a portfolio that meets 0.1 LOLE. Next slide, please. So a few other advantages of this planning approach I'd like to note. So I mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to emphasize that this approach considers both energy and capacity constraints in the SERVM simulations that form its foundation and their interactions. So you can understand that the marginal ELCCs will reflect the energy and capacity constraints of the system. So let's take an example. If LSEs procure a lot of battery storage without procuring sufficient solar energy to charge those batteries, then the system will become energy constrained. And what we'll see is a reduction in the marginal ELCC in the near term of batteries and an increase in the marginal ELCC of solar that can charge those batteries. So in that sense, it will reflect whatever the energy and capacity constraints are of the system, and then incent the right next crop of additions to address those constraints. The second point is that it aligns incentives for demand-side load management with those for supply-side resource accreditation. And so, as I mentioned, the allocation of need to LSEs is based on their load during the critical hours, the same hours that we're using to accredit supply-side resources. And so if you as an LSE are able to shift your load out of those hours, and that is consistently done and flows into your future load forecasts, then you will reduce your procurement need as part of this program. And then lastly, the use of marginal ELCC creates this standardized resource adequacy value, this common currency between resources. So that is a useful means for LSEs and asset owners to contract for that common currency and to plan for and hedge their capacity positions accordingly. Next slide, please. So to note, for folks who haven't been following the evolution of resource adequacy planning in other ISOs and RTOs, this critical periods framework has been adopted by New York ISO, PJM, and MISO under various different names, but it's all sort of a similar marginal accreditation-based approach. So as you can see here, it's been adopted within those RA programs over the last few years. Next slide, please. So one important point for folks to understand is, as I noted, the critical hours are going to be portfolio dependent, and so those are going to change over time. And so it's important for folks to understand why ELCCs will change and how LSEs can mitigate the risk of that for their own portfolio compliance. So this is a table that we published in 2023 in the incremental ELCC study for MTR. And what it shows is the key reasons why ELCCs change and their relative magnitude impact. So I'd say the most important part of this slide for folks to come away with is that the biggest driver of changes in ELCCs is the portfolio evolution over time. And this is actually a feature, not a bug, of this planning method, because what we want is, as the portfolio changes and as the nature of the reliability risk evolves, the hours shift, it becomes energy or capacity constrained, we want that to be reflected in the ELCCs, which represent the investment signal to LSEs and developers. So the next couple rows here are resource shape changes. So generally, these won't change much, except if we have new information that can improve them, or if we're adding additional weather years to the LLP simulations and need to add resource shapes for those years. And then the load shape changes are really driven by the IPER and how that evolves over time. So for instance, if we have EVs charging in the middle of the day versus in the evening, that's going to have an impact on the reliability value of different resources. And then the next three rows are generally less important in their impact for ELCCs. Next slide, please. So as I've noted, again, the system need, the LSE need, and resource accreditation all occurs during the same set of critical hours. And so if you are an LSE, that means that within RCPPP, what will be looked at is your load during those critical hours, and then the contribution of the resources in your portfolio during those same hours. And as noted a moment ago, those critical hours are going to shift as CAISO's loads and resources evolve. And this will change the LSE's need and the marginal ELCCs within its portfolio. So how can LSEs hedge their non-compliance risk associated with the shift in critical hours? They can do so by procuring a diverse portfolio of resources that matches their load across many different hours. So if you're an LSE and you only have solar and storage in your portfolio, then you are potentially at risk of falling out of compliance if the system critical hours shift into the evening. You won't have the resources potentially to cover your load throughout the night, for instance. And so in that sense, this method incentivizes LSEs to procure a diverse portfolio to cover their hours, to cover their load across many hours of the day, similar to slice of day, while allowing them the flexibility to manage that non-compliance risk based on their own risk tolerance. And with that, I will hand it back to Sina.
Thanks, Aaron. Okay, so building off of Aaron's presentation on marginal ELCCs, you'll note that the two reliability options in the staff proposal are also linked to the RA program, RA slice of day to varying degrees. There is a section in the staff proposal where we do kind of differentiate and compare and contrast marginal ELCC to slice of day. So marginal ELCC, I won't go through it all here, as Aaron did a great job explaining that, but basically represents the ability of a resource, marginal resources capacity to contribute to meeting reliability needs. And it measures the contribution of those resources to meet reliability against, perfect capacity. So it puts all resources on a level playing field. Of course, slice of day, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's a different analytical approach. It divides each day into hourly time slices to evaluate how each LSC, how well each LSC's portfolio matches load, plus an hourly reserve margin. Okay, so I won't spend too much time on here. I'm sure we're all fairly knowledgeable about slice of day, but please do refer to section 3.1.6.3 of the staff proposal if you want a refresher on this. But the important thing to note is basically that ELCCs are focused on system level load and resources, but slice of day is focused on the LSC's loads and resources. And also important to note is, these are different analytical methods, but they are both analytically sound, but optimizing for one approach or another is just going to give you slightly different outcomes. Okay, so with that educational background on marginal ELCCs, we'll go into the four tenets of reliability procurement: the need determination, allocation, compliance, and enforcement. So in the next section, we'll start with reliability need determination. So on the next slide, you'll see how we're kind of thinking about this. So for each compliance year, each RCPPP year, the total need is going to be determined by calculating the marginal ELCC percentage of each resource class, multiplying that by the nameplate capacity of the resource class, and then adding up the total accredited ELCC megawatts for the portfolio. And that's basically equivalent to load plus reserves needed to meet a 0.1 LOLE system. So that need is going to be called the initial reliability procurement need, or the RPN. And we would release that for 10 calendar years. So 10 calendar years spans T+0 through T+9. We would release that every February. And then you'll see in the upcoming sections how we would allocate that to each LSC every April. And we would update the resource accounting for the ELCCs every 2 years with new modeling. On the next slide, you'll see that in determining the reliability procurement need, we will include a buffer of 2.5%. That is what we initially proposed. So you take the buffer, you multiply it by 1.025, and you would get the final reliability procurement need. And so the purpose of the buffer is just to mitigate development risk and other causes of insufficient resources being online. And basically, it would help to ensure that LSCs can enter year T+0 sufficiently sourced so that they meet the 0.1 tuned system and RA requirements. So here, kind of a high-level overview of the scope of the two options presented. Option 1, the scope of it is new and existing resources, whereas option 2 focuses on new resources only for RCPPP/IRP related procurement, and it also is linked to an expanded multi-year RA program. So for that one in particular, a common question is what is the definition of a new resource? So we're describing new or defining new vintage resources as those that have come online or will come online no more than 10 years before the compliance year. So that's what we call a new vintage resources. So a new resource need will be a function of online resources, load growth, and assumptions for the rate of retirement and retention of existing resources. So that's how we determine need. And in the next section, you'll see how we allocate that need to LSCs. So for option 1, got ahead of myself. So need allocation, basically we take the final RPN. If you go to the next slide, Alex, sorry about that. So we will allocate that final RPN, that need determination that includes the 2.5% buffer, into each LSC's allocation, which is the reliability procurement requirement for each LSC. So important terminology there. Reliability procurement need is the need determination, and then reliability procurement requirement is each LSC's allocation of that need. We are going to do that allocation based on LSC load forecasts and each LSC's share of managed load during the critical hours found in the need determination. And one important thing to consider here is, we are going to provide 10 years worth of need allocations. The first 5 are binding obligations, and the second 5 are indicative illustrations of need. But basically, the allocations will be fixed or constant within T+2. So what that means is, if an LSC has an RPR in 1 year at years T+2 and T+1, the RPR the following year, when those years become T+1 and T+0, would not be higher than what we found before. Okay, so that's an important consideration. On the next slide, you'll see the concept of a collective capacity reserve, which we have proposed to be set at a minimum of 1.5% of the initial RPN to a maximum of 3.5%. This is just a sliding scale. We are proposing that this collective capacity reserve is to be procured by the investor-owned utilities, who will serve as a central procurement entity within RCPPP. And it's going to be released each year for the calendar years. Here it says T+0 through T+10, but please note it's through T+9. It's a 10 calendar year period. And basically what this is going to do is act as a type of collective insurance against a variety of events. And again, it's going to be procured by the IOUs as a CPE. And basically the intent is to make sure there's enough capacity to address any deficiencies from the non-IOU LSEs. On the next slide, you'll see how the need determination and allocation fit together. So we take the need determination that is system-wide, we include the buffer, and that gives us our final reliability procurement need for the entire system. We then take that need and we allocate it to individual LSEs using their load forecasts and each LSE's share of managed load during the critical hours. And for IOUs only, serving as a central procurement entity, they would have an additional collective capacity reserve allocated to them. On the next slide, you'll see what we mean by years of procurement obligation versus indicative information. So if we release 10 calendar years of information, the first 5 of those, in other words, T+0 through T+4, are binding procurement obligations. And the remaining 5, T+5 through T+9, are going to be indicative information that we'll get just so LSEs can have kind of a illustrative forecast of the later years. And the purpose of the color coding here is just to see the rolling nature of years within each RCPPP cycle. So for example, if you look at T+4 in a hypothetical 2026 to 2027 RCPPP year, T+4 is 2031. And once we go into the following RCPPP year, 2031 is going to become T+3. So that's what we mean by the rolling nature of RCPPP related to procurement obligations. On the next slide, just a few more points on need allocation. Since option 1 is scoped such that it applies to new and existing resources, that means that need allocation is the need that's allocated is the total need. And we are going to give LSEs their procurement obligations for years T+2 through T+4 for option 1. And of course, the remaining 5 years, later 5 years are indicative only. And for option 2, the need that's allocated is the total new need, because recall that option 2 is new resources only for RCPPP procurement with an expanded multi-year RA program. And for option 2, the compliance years are going to be years T+0 through T+4. And you'll see later on how an expanded multi-year program overlaps with that. Okay, next slide, please. So there's an interesting dynamic with central procurement related to RCPPP. If you look in section 4 of the staff proposal for more detail there, this is one way in which this slide deck differs from the original one we published. The words included and excluded were inadvertently flipped, so it gives the impression of maybe not reading as it should have. But basically, the concept is fairly intuitive. There's 2 ways to incorporate new centrally procured resources. The first one is either we include those resources in the need determination and then later on give capacity credits, or we exclude them from the need determination, which in that case, we wouldn't need to give credits if we've already excluded from the need determination. So we have proposed in the staff proposal the first option here, so LSEs can show credits of their centrally procured resources to meet their need allocation, their RPR. Okay, so in the next section, now that we have completed determining need for the system and allocating need to LSEs, we move into measuring compliance and, if necessary, engaging in enforcement. So you'll see in the next slide that we have proposed 2 compliance filings for each RCPPP year. The first, or the preliminary filing, is going to be in December, and that would be a non-binding filing. In other words, it's just kind of like a check mark to see if LSEs are on track, but there's no penalties, no deficiency penalties for that filing. It will be subject to an administrative penalty. In other words, if it's a filing that is not on time, or if there are errors in the filing. So it would be subject to an administrative penalty, but not a deficiency penalty. However, the June filing is the second and final filing of each RCPPP year, and it is binding, and it is subject to both an administrative penalty and a deficiency penalty. And I'll get into the differences between those later on. But some considerations here to keep in mind: contractor owned resources must offer obligation for at least 5 months of the year that staff thinks is going to have significant loss of load, and for the foreseeable future, that's currently the months of May through September. And again, note on central procurement, LSEs would be able to show credits for their centrally procured resources to meet their obligations. However, LSEs will not receive credits from the collective capacity reserve, since that's in addition to meeting the 0.1 LOLE. And on the next slide, you'll see kind of a summary of how we are thinking about compliance for each option. In option 1, you'll see the first row here on this table, and again, this is based on the June compliance showing, since the June showings are the official ones and binding ones. Option 1 is linked to the existing RA program at years T+0 through T+1. So at T+0, the RA requirement LSEs have to show is meeting 100% month ahead, and at T+0, it's 100% month ahead, and at T+1, it's 90% year ahead. And then for years T+2 through T+3, that's where LSEs have an RCPPP obligation. So for those last 3 years, they would be required to show an off-pay contract for new or existing resources. And the percentage of procurement to be shown in those contracts is starts at 100% at T+2, goes to 75% in T+3, and finishes at 50% at T+4, and also at T+2, an interconnection agreement for new resources would have to be shown. On the next slide, you'll see how this kind of relates with a given example here, hypothetical example. So let's say in April of 2026, for example, if we released LSE need allocation, or RPR, for the years 2029 through 2031 rather, that would be years T+2 through T+4. This diagram kind of shows how that would interact with MTR and the RA program, in addition to RCPPP. So you can see here that T+0 would be 2027 in this case. So you can think of it as we would release need allocation in year T-1, so that LSEs know what they have to do beginning in T+0. So for T+0 and T+1, that would be covered by the RA program. And then years T+2 through T+4, in this case, 2029 through 31, would be covered by RCPPP. In option 2, in the next slide, you'll see how this differs from option 1 compliance. Basically, you see how we have an expanded multi-year RA program at the first row. So whereas option 1 compliance had RA covering T+0 through T+1, this option 2, expands that to include T+2 and T+3 as well. So basically, the requirements decreased by 10% in those years. So T+0 and T+1, you have requirements of 100% month ahead and 90% year ahead for RA. And then T+2 and T+3, you have requirements of 80% and 70%. Overlapped on top of that, you do have RCPPP requirements for new resources. So you can see the second row there, what those would be. At T+0, we need to have 100% online. And then at T+1 through T+4, LSEs would have to show enough contracting sufficiency at levels of 90% at T+1, and then decreasing down to 60% at T+4. One thing to note, it's somewhat intuitive, but wasn't explicit in the initial slides, that at T+1, there is a requirement for offtake contract and interconnection agreements. You could infer that at T+2 of 1 year, if you show offtake contracts and interconnection agreements, then it would be likely, hopefully, that you have those the following year at T+1. So please do keep that in mind. And there is another requirement of commercial operations at T+0. So similar to the previous slide, if you go to the next slide, you'll see how this relates to a hypothetical example. So let's say we, for example, issue each LSC's RPR, their need allocation, in April of 2026, which would be T-1. Then under option 2, the need allocation would cover 2027 through 2031 rather. So that's T+0 through T+4. And you can see here how these boxes that are shaded half blue and half green, you could see the overlap with RA, the expanded RA program, and RCPPP coverage. So for years T+0 through T+3, we have an expanded multi-year RA program. And then for years T+0 through T+4, you have RCPPP for new resources. So once we're done with compliance, a portion of that is potentially issuing enforcement penalties for deficient LSCs. So on the next slide, you'll see kind of an overview of enforcement. Basically, each LSC would be subject to financial penalties based on either the extent to which its procurement for each compliance year does not meet the minimum volumes of its allocated need, and the accuracy of its and timeliness of its compliance filing. So the first one is basically the deficiency penalty, and the second one there is the administrative penalty. Given that this is an ongoing and rolling forward program, the penalties would be issued on a rolling basis. So LSCs could be penalized for 1 year, but then also be penalized year after year if they're continuing to be deficient in the procurement. Option 2 includes resource adequacy penalties for the expanded multi-year RA program, but option 1 includes the existing RA penalties for years T+0 and T+1. So you can see in the next slide a table that summarizes these penalties. So you can see that I'll start with the administrative penalty column. You'll see the definition that we have there. This is similar to other definitions that are used throughout the energy division. So here is basically the penalty for accuracy and timeliness under both option 1 and 2. That is going to be assessed twice per year based on December and June filings. So both compliance filings are going to be subject to that. However, the deficiency penalty is assessed only once per year, and that's for the June filing, which is the binding filing. So for deficient contracting sufficiency for option 1 and 2, basically we've calculated that as half of the net cost of new entry. So if we assume net cost of new entry of $15 per kilowatt month, for example, half of that would be $7.50. So that would be the deficiency penalty for insufficient contracting under both options, and it can be waived if LSCs cure that deficiency within 30 days after being notified by ED staff. For online sufficiency, for option 2, similar concept, except the multiplier there is 1. So it's going to be 1 times the net cost of new, the net cone, and it can also be waived within 30 days. So the question arises, why not have online sufficiency for option 1? And again, as I said earlier, option 1 is going to include existing RA penalties. So basically that's covered by the existing RA penalties. However, on the next slide, we acknowledge that since this is a brand new program, it is going to take some time to implement the program and the penalties, and we want to give LSCs some headroom. So basically, we're recommending a phasing in of penalties. So in this chart, you'll see, again, as hypothetical RCPPP years, take, for example, that 2026 through 27 column. The first 4 years that compliance filing would cover, so 2027 through 2030, would be test years. In other words, LSCs would not be subject to a deficiency penalty. They would be subject to an administrative penalty, but this table does not include administrative penalties. It only focuses on deficiency penalties. However, at the final year of that filing, at T+4 in 2031, there would be a penalty for deficient contracting. And you can see how the yellow blocks there kind of progressively step-by-step increase, which with each subsequent RCPPP year. And by the time you get to the June 2030 RCPPP filing, the year T+0 or 2030 in that case would include a penalty for deficient online sufficiency. And again, please be mindful, you'll see there's a footnote in the proposal that says this only applies to deficiency penalties, not the administrative penalties. So those could be added if LSCs have inaccurate filings or are tardy in submitting the filings. Okay, so on the next slide, we will wrap up and summarize the reliability procurement portion of our RCPPP. You'll see on the next slide how the timeline is summarized, again, using hypothetical RCPPP cycles. So let's say, for example, in the 2026 through 27 cycle, what we would do is in February, we would release RCPPP need determination and the LCCs. And in April of 2026, we would allocate that need to LSCs. And then in the December compliance filing, the first filing, which is non-binding, that's when LSCs would show us their progress towards meeting those requirements. But then in June is when we have the final binding compliance filing. The LSCs would be subject to potential deficiency penalties for it. And then you'll see how this just repeats each year. So in the hypothetical next cycle, which would be 27 through 28, we would again release need determination in February, allocate that need in April, do an initial compliance check in December, and then measure final compliance in the June filings. One thing to note, though, of course, recall that option 1 covers need allocation from T+2 through T+2 through 4 for RCPPP, while option 1 covers the need allocation from T+0 through T+4. On the next slide, you'll see a high-level summary of option 1. Again, the scope of option 1 is new and existing resources. We'll calculate the reliability procurement need to meet a 0.1 LOLE using marginal ELCCs plus a 2.5% buffer. We will allocate that need to each LSC for years T+2 through 4, and we'll provide indicative information for years T+5 through 9. IOUs would have a collective capacity reserve of 1.5 to 3%, serving as a central procurement entity. And again, the compliance filings would occur in December and June of each RCPPP year. The June filing is the final binding filing. Again, just a summary of what those requirements are. Basically, you have requirements throughout T+2 through T+4 for contracting. And for enforcement, if LSCs are deficient, they would be subject to penalties. But again, those penalties would be phased in. And then in option 2, you'll see on the next slide, summary of this option. Again, that applies to new resources only for RCPPP related procurement and includes an expanded multi-year RA program with assumptions for retention and retirement of existing resources. So much of this is similar to option 1. We calculate an RPN to meet 0.1 LOLE and include a buffer. However, this resource does include, or this option does include, a new vintage resource definition. We are going to allocate need to each LSC using load forecasts during critical hours. One distinction, of course, given the scope of option 2, is that each LSC's allocation is total new need and is binding for years T+0 through 4. The collective capacity reserve also applies here, similar to option 1. And then compliance is fairly similar to option 1, except given the nature that this covers T+0 through T+4, it does have additional requirements, and it does have expanded RA requirements from T+0 through T+3. For enforcement under option 2, similar penalties related to net cost of new entry, but you do also have multi-year RA penalties that could potentially be applied if LSEs are deficient. And on the next slide, kind of the grand finale, high level summary slide of both options is here. I won't go through all of this again, but good slide to refer to if you need an overview of both options side by side. Okay. On the next section here, I just want to note that we did include some questions to stakeholders. You'll see starting on the next slide. In section 5.1 of the staff proposal, these are the questions that we are interested to hear stakeholder feedback on in comments. Won't go through these all here, but please do refer to these, and staff would definitely appreciate stakeholder comments on these questions. On the next slide, you'll see kind of the remaining questions. But again, won't go through these, but please do give us your feedback and answers to those questions. And with that, if we go to the next slide, I think we have reached our place to take a 10-minute break. So with that, I'll hand it over to Nathan, unless if you want to say anything. If not, we can take about a 10-minute break.
I think we covered it. That was just a lot of info, and we are definitely on pace for a record number of questions in an IRP workshop. My memory serves, I believe our previous record was around 120, and we're already at 90. So thank you everyone for all the thinking. You can see a lot of us, well, you can't see the feverish typing, but you can see its results in us trying to address the Q&A in a timely fashion. Thanks in advance for those of you that are getting responses from us that say, hey, we need to think about this a little bit more, because in a couple instances, the question is so good that we actually do have to do that, and we might have to set expectations that a response won't come from us on it until we post this Q&A transcript sometime next week. There's also a couple that for now we're kind of aggregating into something that maybe we can respond to in a more verbal fashion at the end. So please do be patient with us on those. I know that, you know, at the end we will have already covered other parts of the program, and these questions for now are just based on reliability things for the most part. But we will get to them, and we hope to you know, do a little bit more service to what we're proposing to help inform your comments through going that route. It's 10:20 right now. It's a little bit past schedule, I think, for us, but that's okay. Let's just assume that we're going to start promptly at 10:30. Thanks, everyone. All right, everyone, I think we're already past 10:30 deadline that I imposed. Sorry about being a bad facilitator there. So I think instead of waiting to cover the, call it ELCC versus slice of day paradigm questions that we're getting in the Q&A until the verbal Q&A section at the very end of the workshop, we should just take a couple minutes now to try to dig in a little bit and caveat up front that we know that, philosophically and methodologically, things based on ELCC versus things based on slice of day might be in conflict. I think, for years, ever since both IRP and RA started entertaining paradigms that were based on different things, and sometimes fundamentally, that this sort of discussion was coming. And so we're very happy to have it here. I don't expect it to be totally conclusive. One of the reasons why we have two options in the reliability part of this proposal, one that's based more on ELCCs, one that's more focused on slice of day, is because we want to see, what stakeholder feedback is like, and if we can get to a better place where we know that the two are or are not compatible. I think we're coming out with kind of a neutral stance. If you would ask me, I think that they are, but I still want to be able to work through with stakeholders, the staff here, the consultants, to figure out what does a future look like. Do you really have to pick one, or is there a place that you can get to where they're compatible and maybe serving slightly different purposes? So there's been a couple questions in the chat that we've somewhat addressed, but want to do a little bit more verbally here. So you saw Neil just flip on his camera. I might call on Aaron from E3, Sina, Jamie, or Zoe if you want to speak up at all. Obviously, feel free. But I'm going to try to break these questions into a couple components. The first ones that I started seeing in the chat were regarding what might be a point of confusion of, hey, you guys, especially in the intro slides to the reliability section, tee up a fundamental part of the reliability component being marginal ELCC. And does that just override slice of day? And the answer is no. In this case, and I think for both reliability options, what we're proposing, and maybe could have worded a little bit differently, is we're proposing a marginal ELCC methodology be used for kind of the upstream parts of this process, such as setting the need determination and then allocating it across LSCs. But anywhere in the proposal where you see slice of day being live, so in, I guess it's the first year of option one, and then for 3 years in option two, wherever you see slice of day being live, assume that slice of day rules are in effect. So whatever gets adopted in the RA proceeding. We did serve this proposal and the ruling, et cetera, on multiple proceedings, IRP, RA, and RPS notably. And that might partially explain why we're also at a record number of attendees for an IRP workshop, hovering around 300 right now. But we want to kind of verbalize a little bit more that just because you might be setting need or allocating need based on one method, like ELCCs, it doesn't necessarily mean incompatible with slice of day. There's some other things out there that I put in the chat regarding, hey, you have overlapping needs of 100% of IRP set ELCC in a certain year that overlaps with 90% of the slice of day. Are those two compatible? I've hinted in the Q&A that we at least have internal information where we studied a few kind of test case LSCs where in those instances, usually a slice of day portfolio built something slightly bigger than the requirements that we're posing here that are based on marginal ELCC. But if one were to expand the sample size, I think you could entertain the idea that that pattern won't always hold and that it might veer in either direction, not just one. But I'll kind of slow down and hand off to Neil, Aaron, and Sina, maybe Neil first, just on further thoughts on, what's the interaction between these two things? What did we envision that maybe isn't in the proposal, or just clarifications on, what did we mean when we said certain things in the proposal?
Thanks, Nathan. Morning, folks. I think, perhaps just to start out, I would say long-term, ideally, we have a unified approach to need determination for reliability and resource accreditation across the full planning and procurement horizon. but given we're making improvements here to existing processes, we put out a proposal which I think addresses how to get all the good reasons for RCPPP in place, whilst acknowledging all the work that's gone in RA and slice of day. And so, as Nathan said, it's pretty, I think, open to staff as to what that ideal unified future would be. And I think I take the view that we've got an opportunity now to have both frameworks operating and working in parallel, and learn from those. I think it is worth like just touching on like the background and the context for slice of day and marginal ELCC slice of day. I'll defer to others more expert amongst my colleagues on this. But my take is that it's really fit for purpose for RA's role and focused on resource retention for reliability, and then it's really trying to ensure that the growth in battery deployment or storage deployment is managed in line with sufficient energy for charging batteries. And I'm not going to capture all the benefits of that approach, but compared to its predecessor approach in RA. And then in IRP, as Aaron outlined earlier, going back to around 2022, I think we introduced, we've had capacity expansion modeling using ELCC-based approaches since the start of IRP. And then in 2022, we had load-serving entities directly need to comply with reliability requirements in their plan, and those were based on marginal ELCCs. And the features of that approach are, in our view, a good, strong fit with the mid to long term thinking that we need to do in IRP about resource mix and how that needs to, we need to continually be identifying the optimal resource mix for our future, and then monitoring how it needs to change as we get new information on technology and costs and load and all the key things. So ELCCs inherently help us do that, and there's a reasonable degree of familiarity of using them in the IRP context, which I think can complement the use of slice of day in RA. So there's a bit of a belt and suspenders approach here. I think some of the questions around like which one will be more binding for which year, and it'll depend on the LSE, and Nathan mentioned we've done some analysis on trying to understand that ourselves. But I think the main takeaway is it'll depend on the LSE, and until there's one sort of unified approach to cover the full all the years of the planning horizon, that's quite a powerful feature we have, is a belt and suspenders, particularly in this current period of reliability concern. And yeah, and I'll just perhaps just stop here with a final point, just about option 1 and 2 in reliability. I think the role of ELCCs is a difference in them, in the sense that option 2 is more focused on defining new resources. Option 1 is all resources competing with one another. So yes, there's some differences in how ELCCs and slice of day are used in that regard, but there are other important differences between those options. Like as I mentioned, getting at to the extent the focus is on new resources, and the CPUC's role in having to define what that means under option 2 versus option 1, allowing LSCs and generators to basically figure out that themselves. But I could pause there and turn to Aaron, I think, or Sina.
Yeah, I can add a few thoughts here, Neil. So just kind of picking up on the point about RCPPP and IRP generally, focusing on new resources that are needed. I think this is really just a continuation of the historical practices. We've always had this, these two proceedings, RA focused on the near term, getting resources into the market on a month and year ahead basis, and then this long-term planning process for new resource additions. In the past, that within LTPP was looking out 10 years, and it was just about, how many new gas plants you need to build. And there were much fewer buyers in the market. So now we have a lot more LSEs, and we have new resource types that are being added that have a lot more interactive effects. And so marginal ELCC is a method that can capture how those new resources and their contributions are evolving as the portfolio evolves. It can also provide the right incentives to this very big and diverse set of LSEs so that they have the right information to know what resources should be added to the system to provide incremental reliability benefits. A few other things just to note between the two programs. So they both use the same 0.1 LOLE standard. So in that sense, they're all tied to the same reliability target and foundational modeling and SERVM in support of that. And then, as I noted earlier, and then I would just reference folks to section 3.1.6.3 of the staff proposal, which goes into more on the differences between the two methods. But as I mentioned earlier, within the marginal ELCC critical periods framework, you as an LSE would have to cover your load during the critical periods, which is a subset of covering your load across all hours. So you can comply with covering your load during the critical periods without potentially covering your load across all hours. But as I noted earlier, that does put you at non-compliance risk if the critical hours shift into other periods when you're not covering your load.
Thanks for that, Aaron. Tina, anything you'd add to the conversation?
No, I think Neil and Aaron covered it well, but just to kind of reiterate, I think what Nathan said, I think that this is jointly filed in RA, and so depending on what happens there, what happens in here would have to happen in RA as well. So this is just a proposal and nothing fully adopted yet. So just keep in mind that this does have to go through the RA proceeding as well. And just want to highlight what Neil said about having a kind of a holistic approach, hopefully sometime in the future. But the fact that marginal ELCC is focused on system level resources and loads, and LSE is focused on each LSE's own loads and resources, I think provide a good balance with each other throughout option 1 and 2. But nothing further to add.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tina. I'm really curious to see what folks come back with in comments. We expect a wide range of them, everything from this will work great to this is absurd and we've already told you that, and everything in between. The need for a bit of a reckoning here, I think, is something that most of us agree with. Of let's really force ourselves to have tough conversations about how we want to count and what methods we want to use and philosophies, etc. So this is meant to tease out that. Sorry if that's a little bit unsatisfying for the workshop, for those of you that would have expected all answers to be provided here that you could then work from in your comments. We really are leaning on you as stakeholders to help us sharpen our thinking here on things like, say, in option 2, how well does a marginal ELCC based overlay for new work on top of an expansion time-wise per slice of day. But with that, I think most of us are going to get back to trying to deal with the now 109 questions in the queue, and we know more are coming, but thank you very much for all of the questions so far. This is extremely helpful for us and for everyone. And hand things off to Sierra Withers for GHG.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sierra Withers, and I am a utilities engineer here on IRP, and I will be walking us through the greenhouse gas reduction procurement section of this presentation. Next slide. So I will get into the rationale for what we are proposing as an option for our greenhouse gas reduction design. We are putting forward one option of a clean energy standard, which we will be calling a CES, which most of you already know, with backward-looking compliance and zero emission credits, which you will hear us call ZECs. So the CES option would build on the proven success of the Renewable Portfolio Standards program. However, the staff proposal also asks if existing processes could be used instead, or if parties have any alternatives, and we ask you all to submit them in your comments. So some of the key rationales for why the CES was further refined over pursuing a mass-based approach that we had in the staff options paper includes its accuracy, its outcomes, the associated administrative burden, its scalability, and the fact that a CES avoids duplication. So the biggest of these are that a mass-based approach is more difficult to administer, as well as imprecise on a forward-looking basis compared to a CES. The fact that it is more scalable due to its use of standardized, trackable, and fungible compliance instruments, and also that it avoids duplication with existing mass-based greenhouse gas regulation under CARB's cap and trade program. Next slide, please. So the CES option would establish an annual clean energy target as a % of retail sales for LSCs. This target would be based on the amount of clean energy needed to achieve the electric sector GHG target as determined in the IRP planning track. At a minimum, these targets must achieve the clean energy goals of SB 1020 and SB 100, which include 90%, 95%, and 100% of retail sales supplied by eligible renewable and zero carbon resources by 2035, 2040, and 2045, respectively. LSCs would need to demonstrate that they contracted for a steadily increasing quantity of clean energy that would be sufficient to meet their percentage requirement, and that they contracted with eligible resources, which would include RPS eligible resources plus a broader set of greenhouse gas free resources. Rules and compliance requirements would be aligned with the RPS program, including the 3-year compliance periods and the penalty of $50 per megawatt hour for each deficient megawatt hour. And we'll get into more details on that in a bit. But on the next slide, I will begin expanding on the background of why greenhouse gas reduction procurement is necessary. So currently, the modeling that occurs in IRP and Resolve includes 3 separate policy constraints. So this includes RPS obligations through 60% in 2030 and beyond, and then the clean resource targets established in SB 100 and SB 1020, which I mentioned earlier. And finally, CPUC's adopted greenhouse gas target within the CARB range. So this greenhouse gas target is 24.3 MMT in 2030, 20.3 MMT in 2035, 13.7 MMT in 2040, and 7.1 MMT in 2045. So we want to note that RPS/CES in greenhouse gas modeling and Resolve aligns with the current counting conventions, and the RPS/CES credits are produced when a clean energy megawatt is delivered, which is including during periods of CAISO exports, while greenhouse gas emissions are produced when a CAISO gas plant operates or when unspecified imports occur. The CES option would send signals for LLCs to procure additional clean energy beyond RPS requirements in order to achieve California's greenhouse gas reduction goals, further aligning procurement with planning already done in IRP. So the CES option really is intended to bridge the gap between the RPS goal and the SB 100 goal. Next slide, please. I will now discuss the modeled CAISO greenhouse gas emissions with and without policy constraints. So you can see this graph on the right is showing a sensitivity analysis in Resolve that was conducted during the 2023 PSP to assess the impact of the RPS and SB 100 in greenhouse gas target constraints. So in case 1, there is no clean energy policy, but it does include CARB's cap and trade price floor. You can see this in black on the graph on the right. And then in case 2, you can see what happens with the addition of RPS and SB 100 and SB 1020 targets, but still no greenhouse gas target. And you can see that, you can see case 2 in blue to the right. Case 3 models what happens with the addition of a greenhouse gas target. So case 3 in green on the right includes CARB's cap and trade as well as RPS through 2030. And SB 100 and 1020 targets, as well as a GHG target. So the three constraints above lead to different resource portfolios that produce very different emission results, as you can see. The modeled economics, including carbs cap and trade prices, lead to continued economic greenhouse gas reduction up to a point. But this does not necessarily mean that LLCs would pursue this procurement without compliance targets. But by 2030 through 2035, RPS and SB 100 targets bind and push greenhouse gas emissions slightly lower in case 2, but not to the levels that are needed. So the main takeaway here on this slide is that achieving the aggressive CPUC adopted greenhouse gas targets require significant further procurement beyond the existing RPS targets, which is basically why an additional greenhouse gas reduction procurement mechanism is needed. And then we are proposing the CES as an option for this needed procurement mechanism. On to the next slide. I will now get into the steps of the Clean Energy Standard need determination. So this requires aligning the CES target with the CPUC's greenhouse gas target, as mentioned. So first, we would run resolve with a binding greenhouse gas target, and then we would derive the annual achieved CES percentage. And finally, we would allocate CES percentage target to the LSCs. So the percentage targets are defined by CAISO retail sales and would therefore be allocated using the LSC level retail sales times the CES target percentage derived in step 2. So you can see here on the right the clean energy needs in 2030 for different RPS or CES percentages. And you can see that the CES minimum, which is the RPS minimum plus greenhouse gas free resources, still requires 19% of additional clean energy above the SB 100 minimum to reach that 30 MMT greenhouse gas target by 2030. So this concluded more of the background on the clean energy standard, and on the next slide, we will get into the CES need determination. So you can see kind of here a visual of the CES compliance periods. These would match the current RPS compliance periods with a slightly different first year of the program due to timing considerations. So the need determination for the first compliance period would be released in 2026, which is 2 years before the compliance period starts. In all other years, binding CS requirements would be set at the beginning of the prior compliance period, 3 years before the compliance period starts. So you can see that difference in the first year if this option were to be adopted. You can see in the graph below that no CES targets will be set in compliance period 5 as that is currently underway. But like I mentioned earlier, under this option in 2026, that CES binding requirement would be set for compliance period 6, which would begin in 2028. And then at that same time, indicative CES percentages would be released for the following 2 compliance periods. And then more typical of what would happen in the future is at the beginning of CP6, the CES binding requirement would be set for compliance period 7, which would begin in 2031, and indicative percentages would be released for the following 2 compliance periods after that. So at the bottom of the slide here, obviously this can get a little bit confusing with the different years and them spanning 3 years, but you can see the indicative CES targets from the draft 25-26 TPP base case portfolio. So everyone can kind of get a sense of what the CES annual procurement targets would look like within the compliance periods. Next slide, please. So I will now get into the CES need allocation. So it would be the same allocation methodology that is currently used in the RPS program to set RPS targets. So under the CES, the LSCs would be required to match a percentage of their annual retail sales with renewable and or zero carbon energy. The CES requirement increases when either the electric greenhouse gas target goes down, which would necessitate a higher CES percentage target, or as an LSC's load grows, which would drive an increased CES megawatt hour procurement requirement, even if the LSC's CES percentage requirement did not change. So each LSC CES target would be the same as the percentage target set at the need determination stage, with each LSC's need being defined as its annual retail electricity sales multiplied by that CES percentage. So the LSC's need metric is an annual percentage target of CES eligible generation as a share of those retail sales. So on the next slide, I will begin taking us through CES compliance and enforcement. So as mentioned before, multi-year compliance periods, also known as CPs, would align with RPS and be assessed at the compliance period level. So the CPUC would be establishing annual procurement targets, which you saw on that previous slide, for each year within a compliance period. And as for monitoring, annual compliance reports and achievement of annual procurement targets would be used to inform Energy Division staff about that LSE compliance progress and could provide an early indication of potential compliance issues. But whether an LSE achieves their annual procurement target would not inform CES compliance and would not be the basis for enforcement action, similar to RPS. However, CES compliance and subsequent enforcement action would be based on whether an LSE meets their multi-year CES compliance or multi-year CP requirement as reported in their final compliance report. So on the next slide, we will talk about how staff will be leveraging RPS to the maximum extent possible. As I'm sure many of you have noticed, we've been mentioning RPS a lot. So with the idea that the CES would exist alongside RPS, leveraging RPS compliance rules and program infrastructure will be a large facet of this option. So currently under the RPS program, retail sellers submit 2 annual filings. The first are the RPS procurement plans, which demonstrate that LSEs are procuring consistent with the goal of increasing California's reliance on renewable resources. So these are ones that we mentioned will not be used for enforcement action, but will be submitted annually. So the second is RPS compliance reports, which happen once the compliance period is over and the CEC has issued its verification report for the compliance period. So LSEs submit final RPS compliance reports to the CPUC for a final compliance determination, and that's where enforcement action would be taken. So for RCPPP, staff proposes to expand both RPS filings into RPS and CES procurement plans and RPS and CES compliance reports to hopefully lessen the administrative burden on LSEs. So all existing RPS reporting requirements would remain, but new reporting requirements and tools would be developed to implement and measure that progress towards the CES procurement requirements. So continuing on through compliance onto the next slide, the CPUC would work with Regis to establish zero emission credits as the metric for CES compliance to be created for each megawatt hour of greenhouse gas free generation from non-RPS eligible resources. So the definition of eligible resources for which ZECs would be created and tracked would be established in the IRP proceeding. We've definitely gotten a lot of questions on this, but that will be a separate process where we are determining what the eligible resources for zero emission credits will be, what they will be. So ZECs would include an e-tag system to track where generation geographically occurs, which would be used as a basis for establishing eligibility. Both RECs and ZECs could be used to comply with the CES, and to promote that fungibility between RPS and CES, the same REC could be used to meet RPS and CES compliance, somewhat similar to how new RPS resources can count towards IRP requirements under recent decisions. On to enforcement. Next slide, please. So at the end of each compliance period, based on the LSE's final compliance report, the penalty amounts would be set at that $50 per megawatt hour. Enforcement would be backwards looking, meaning that enforcement would be following the CPUC's final compliance determination regarding whether the LSE retired the minimum quantity of eligible RECs and ZECs to satisfy its compliance requirement. So noting the similarity that under the RPS program, penalty amounts are set at $50 per REC and are applied to the REC shortfall from a retail seller's RPS procurement obligation. In establishing a citation program, the CPUC could consider the conditions that would warrant granting a waiver from citations. For example, if LSEs were prevented due to conditions beyond the LSE's control. So on to the next slide, just as kind of a summary. So the need determination would be defined in the form of a minimal annual clean energy standard percentage that is consistent with meeting the electric sector greenhouse gas target. That CES percentage would be based on calculating annual CES eligible generation relative to KYSL annual retail sales from a greenhouse gas compliant IRP system planning portfolio. Then for the need allocation, an LSC's allocated need is its retail sales forecast multiplied by the annual CES percentage. And then compliance would then be measured in the 3-year compliance periods we talked about, based on a backwards looking review of RECs and ZECs by comparing the megawatt hour of credits retired during a compliance period to that total LSC compliance period megawatt hour requirement. And then enforcement would impose a financial penalty of $50 per megawatt hour for each megawatt hour of deficiency within the compliance period. So on to the next slide. Similar to Sina, I wanted to show the summary of questions that we have asked stakeholders to answer in their comments, but I will not be going into all of these, but looking forward to seeing party comments on that. And so with that, thank you, and I will hand it back over to Nathan for next steps.
Thanks for that, Sierra. So next slide should have a couple next steps listed. Thank you. As stated near the beginning, the key next steps are really comments and replies. So comments, instead of being due in early June, as originally proposed, are now due July 15th, and replies a few weeks after that on August 5th. But the bigger thing that we have to discuss here is third bullet, beautifully short and eloquent, of second workshop TBD. Not even a question mark or any other punctuation to indicate where we stand on this. But I'd say we've got a bunch of time left over. We originally budgeted until 1 p.m. to talk today. And I think we can take a few minutes here to kind of riff on some different process things that could happen from here over the coming weeks and months to get us to a better place. So seeing 139 questions in the Q&A already, probably some more to come, and just kind of sifting through and getting a feeling for where are we in terms of party understanding of what's going on, and then maybe also some party desire to talk things over either with us or amongst each other, etc. I'm wondering if we're headed towards a place of, should we consider some other type of stakeholder, whether it be workshop or similar type of forum, to get to a better place, and what the timing of that should be. I recall seeing some folks asking for that before comments were due, and there would be certainly some logistical hurdles to doing that, but not saying it's impossible. And then also noting that I think that the ruling in the proposal alluded to, if not explicitly stated, the concept of, yes, there's going to be a lot of implementation detail associated with this. We know that, we acknowledge it, and thus I would anticipate much stakeholder activity on that happening kind of downstream of comments and whatever comes back out of the CPUC after those comments. But we want to make sure that we're not rushing into something that is admittedly quite big. We want to make sure we have all the technical details right that we need in order to at least adopt something. Because again, some technical details possible could maybe be deferred to later in the process after something's adopted. And doing that balance with the urgency that some folks feel about getting new requirements out there. And that's not just for the reliability part of the program, which we've done a lot of work on an IRP since our first procurement order was issued in November of 2019. 2 more have been issued since then that you're very well familiar with, the vast majority of which was termed in reliability resources. But to keep the reliability picture healthy, we have heard from some folks, and some of us feel internally, that having a set of reliability requirements emanating from IRP that goes a little bit further out into the future beyond the roughly 2028 year that is kind of the culmination of the MTR requirements, even though yes, some of them can be deferred to 2031, but that's a relatively small amount of the total MTR requirement. Just to help answer what signals are we sending beyond 2028 for reliability? A lot of us were hoping to get some part of RCPPP stood up in time to inform procurement in that window. and we're starting to bump up against that timeline, so to speak. But in other quarters, we hear potentially even more urgency, depending on what information's in front of you, about getting GHG-free requirements out the door, whether that be through the ones that Sierra just described in the CES option that we put forward in the paper that would emanate from IRP, or some other way of getting more GHG-free resources on the grid. It's very important to get those signals out there too, because 60% RPS gets us a lot of the way there, but I think we're acknowledging here that we need something else to get us to the 2045 finish line, and that's a lot of what Sierra was just discussing. And getting those requirements and signals out there, we think is very, very important, and time is of the essence. So we're trying to do the best balance we can between getting something smart and robust out there, and the time that takes, and setting new procurement requirements. While we don't have a perfect answer on exactly when that would happen, I think a lot of people can kind of do the math in their heads of, depending on what resource type you're trying to get, what's the lead time that you should expect, even before trying to build in uncertainties like tariffs, et cetera, and other policy, particularly at the federal level, that might affect our ability to do certain things. So with that said, I think what I'll pivot to is, what's the next stakeholder engagement look like? And if there's going to be more things like a workshop, what's the appropriate format for those things? And just some personal thoughts there. We did just spend a lot of time as staff and consultants to bake this proposal, to have a fair amount of very spirited discussion internally to get to what we released on the 29th and what we just covered here in the workshop, and are hoping to be able to lean on stakeholders a lot for this next phase to get to better thinking. So if we were to host, or if there were to be a forum for another discussion, if we can call it that, if it's not going to be a workshop, we would hope that parties would be taking the lead to do a fair amount of the thinking, and whether that be responding to what we just put out there on the 29th, and or putting together proposals that they think are viable to fill in certain parts of the program that they either don't think is viable, or maybe you see a gap somewhere. Identification of those things is extremely important, and your smart thinking to help us to get to a better place is absolutely essential to help us get there. So if we were to have another stakeholder type event, my first stab would be to put the impetus on you as parties to think about, what could you bring to that conversation? I guess before that, do you want to bring something to that conversation? And then is that maybe something that staff could facilitate, but not be a protagonist in, so to speak? Because we really do feel that we're passing a large amount of information in this proposal over to you all to think about for the time being. And we want to hear your reactions. Though we do acknowledge that, yes, we do anticipate answering the now 143 questions that are in the Q&A, at least now, either here in the Q&A or within a few days in the transcript that we post. But we're acknowledging that that might not be the end of your interaction with us. We really hope it's not. So we acknowledge that, yeah, some more talking with staff and hearing our thoughts on certain things could be central to informing your comments, but at this point, we're really hoping to hear more from you. So let me pause for a second. I don't know if other folks want to jump in from the panelists to cover things that maybe I missed. So I'll give that a second, and then we'll kind of pivot to if and how we can take further feedback from this group, whether that be, say, polling that we actually can do through the WebEx on what sort of stakeholder interaction options we could entertain in the coming weeks and months, all the way to let's hear from a few stakeholders verbally. But anything else people would add from the panel before I pivot to that?
And I suppose I was just imagining that stakeholders who sought the extension of comments and suggested a second workshop probably already had ideas on the purpose of the workshop. And Nathan was suggesting what those possible purposes could be. I could imagine it's for parties to propose their own alternative designs or yeah, totally new designs or alternative designs to what are in the staff proposal. And if that's the purpose, back to Nathan's question is, yeah, how do we structure discussion around that? So whether it's polling folks now for topics or maybe giving folks more time after the workshop to email through ideas. I think we're open to various approaches.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's put the impetus back on those that formally proposed another workshop-like event recently. Please do maybe nominate someone from amongst your team to speak up here in a few moments. I'll take a few of these questions. I see 4 people with their hand up right now in the attendee list, so we'll get to them sequentially. And then after that, I'd like to get back to folks that formally proposed workshop. Please nominate someone to put their hand up so we can get to them and see if they have any thinking on what they would want from that interaction, and if and how we could do it. So going to the people with hands up, Doug Carper, you're going to be first. A reminder, the functionality is going to be one of us will unmute you, and then you will hear well, I shouldn't say here. You should be prompted to unmute yourself after we request you to unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to talk. So let's start with Doug.
So clean energy. Thank you so much. And actually, I wanted to endorse, I think, the vision that you have of putting together proposals. I think, I've already got a couple of ideas around particular topics. I'm happy to email those to you. And I'd be happy to present on those at a workshop as well. And one of the other thoughts too that occurred to me, like looking at the chat and knowing what issues people are thinking about, it might be a worthwhile thing for perhaps your team to field like emails about I'm looking at a proposal on the reliability reserve. I'm looking at a proposal around the definition of U. I'm looking at a proposal on topic X, and then possibly put those stakeholders who are thinking about the same topics in touch with each other so that we can talk about them and maybe like have a single proposal or 2 proposals rather than 10, given the number of folks. But yeah, I do think the process I would envision is email you, maybe talk to other people who are thinking about the same issue, maybe come in and talk to the team first about like, this is what we're thinking, what do you think? And then propose it at a workshop so that everybody can weigh in on what a silly idea it is. Something like that.
Doug, that helps a lot. Thank you. And keeping with the spirit and kind of the format of Doug's answer there, the next folks that are going to speak up, if we could just keep it to let's talk about process. So if you have other policy points or questions that you want to raise about the presentation that we just covered, let's hold on to those for now. We will get to them. But I want to just cover the idea of further process here. And let's not get into specific policy or proposal stuff now, but more just focus on the process. So thanks, Doug. Next is Shayna.
Shauna Lazaro on behalf of the of SAHA, and I guess I appreciate that reminder not to go into substance right now. I feel like most of the parties here today put in pretty detailed comments a couple of years ago now. And something that would be really helpful for SAHA, and I imagine for others, would be more an opportunity to have responses to comments. So I feel like what is being proposed in the staff proposal now is not particularly responsive to the concerns around statutory compliance and need to mesh with RA and the urgency around procuring. And so I'm not sure exactly what the process would be for getting what I thought we would see after all this time, which is like more substantive response to comments of, well, we understand the statutory requirements, and I'm sorry, I am going into detail. So I think my proposal might be something like either conversations or written response to comments during this period. I'm not opposed to what Doug was suggesting of grouping people together and having more kind of small group meetings. And I think that shared proposals makes a lot of sense.
Thanks, Shauna. And regarding responses, I can just say, just process-wise, written is going to be difficult considering the volume of comments that we got in response to that September 22 paper. But we can think about like what's a better way to make sure that questions still get answered, but in a timely fashion, because we do still want to keep deadlines here. But thank you. If you have asked your question and it's been answered, please feel free to lower your hand. Let's move on to Kathleen. And it looks like I accidentally unmuted Julia. Julia, why don't you go? Sorry, Kathleen, we'll get to you next.
Okay, hi, Julia Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California. We were one of the entities that strongly supported both the extension of time and the need for another workshop. These are really important, complicated issues, and I think workshops allow for more back and forth and questions in real time, and I think ultimately are going to be more efficient given the complexity of all these issues. And so one topic I would propose for a next workshop, which I think warrants probably several hours because it's a key part of this proposal, is the greenhouse gas emissions standard. There are a lot of complicated terms that can be interpreted all different ways, things like zero emission, for example. Are some resources going to be just deemed zero emission, or are all resources going to need to do a life cycle analysis? If so, using which model? And is the Air Board going to be consulted on that? Or is there going to be some de minimis threshold? And then what about resources that can provide carbon negative emissions? So there are a lot of complicated factors around how to do greenhouse gas analyses that I think warrant a lot of conversation to get it right. The other issue, and it may be just me, but I find really confusing and I think could use a much more in-depth discussion, is how the CES and the RPS will overlay. Given that the RPS is statutory, is the clean energy standard only going to apply to the 40%, that can be RPS or zero emission, or is it going to apply to everything after a certain point? So I think these are all super important issues. I really do encourage you to have at least one more workshop, because I think we all get farther when things can be discussed instead of just a paper back and forth, which doesn't really lend itself to problem solving. It sort of tends to put people more in their corners and dig in. So that's my request for process. Thank you.
Noted, Julia. Thank you. Now, Kathleen.
Thank you. Appreciate that. No worries. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks so much for this. Thanks so much for the paper and for this presentation. So from a process perspective, we also really support the extension, appreciate that, but the workshop is key, right? That's a huge part of what I'm hoping we'll do. Just to kind of frame some timing around that, I would ideally like us to have those conversations by the end of June, so we can have a couple weeks to work on our comments so that they're helpful for you and answering the questions you've posed. I also appreciate, Nathan, your encouragement that what would make an additional conversation helpful, because that's what we're looking for, right? To use all of our times wisely and respectfully. I think an in-person opportunity would be so helpful, because I agree with you. Part of what I think I heard you mention that I also believe we need is party conversations. So not just staff to parties, but each of us talking to each other to better understand the needs within the program and from the parties would be very useful. The second thing that I think will be there, while this was excellent for understanding your proposal, your paper, and where we're starting, the link that we need to jump to next is a better understanding of how these different options might impact reality and impact our procurement, our reliability, our clean energy goals, I think we're still missing that on our side, of a better understanding of which option 1 or option 2 gets us farther or closer to the overall state goals, right? So that's one thing I think the workshop could really focus on is putting some reality around this and helping us all get a better sense of what the likely outcomes might be. The third thing I'd flag for you is I can better understand the reliability side of this. I'm still struggling with this clean energy side. I agree with the speaker who mentioned the overlay, but part of what I'm struggling with is how we are going to ensure that we are both reliable from a system and a local, if needed, perspective, if that's included, and then flexibility. If we're integrating all this clean energy resources, how do we make sure we have the fleet that we want? And that's the piece, those linkages that I'd like to see us flesh out in the future, hopefully in-person workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Not the first plug we've heard for in-person, and that's something, well, I should say a sentiment that we hold strongly internally is yes, if we're going to do another interaction like this in person, deserves mention for sure. Let's go to Hillary.
GMH Energy, I'm thankful for the workshop. Thanks for all your work. But yeah, a lot of the same sentiments as Kathleen. The best conversations I've had so far about this have been in various settings discussing the pros and cons, especially of option 1 versus 2. That is the best method I've had so far of really understanding what is being proposed and how it could impact reality, like Kathleen was saying. So yeah, I think an in-person where, I don't know if there's, maybe it's LSEs give their pros and cons, maybe some developer groups give their pros and cons. That could be really valuable. And then the other thing that I think would be useful in the workshop is for an opportunity for stakeholders to discuss or present maybe on items they think are missing. For example, alignment with CAISO processes. You know, I'm sure there are many things that people have on their minds that are kind of missing and need to be addressed. So that would be useful for the next workshop as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. Nick.
For hosting this, Nick Pappas for ACP California. I won't cover a lot of the ground that's been covered by others here, but I want to say first, just kudos. This is a huge proposal. I think from the developer community, we really appreciate the effort here and really support the intent to make this structured, predictable, clear for LSEs so we get the necessary development in the ground and underway. I'll echo the comments on just, how much there is to digest here, and, the flood of comments and questions reflects how many details there are to parse out. I do strongly echo the comments that there would be a lot of value in another workshop to work through those details. We're also, individually, collectively, in various different forms, trying to work amongst ourselves to navigate those specific details. I think one potential trade-off in that process of not doing that is in a formal workshop process is, the proposals were drafted by Energy Division and the consultant. You all have, clearly views and ideas on why things are the way they are and why they might not be the way they're not. And I think there may be some missed opportunities if we talk amongst ourselves in forums which do not have the benefit of, the authors and the decision makers being present. So I think a lot of that can happen outside the workshop process, but I think there are some limits there. So I guess one specific question I have is whether are you open to, you collectively or individually open to joining some of those outside conversations so that we can ask you questions, get your feedback as we're trying to navigate the pros and cons. And before I accidentally remute myself, I'll just make one other point, which is, as much as I think the details are really critical to get resolved here, I mean, we're laying out a decade plus of the framework upon which we'll build a many billion-dollar system that is driving so much impact for the state. There is some urgency here. We're certainly concerned about procurement after MTR rolls off, procurement for SB 100 compliance. So, if we get into a situation where this is not clearly able to be resolved quickly, I think it's important to keep the pedal on for resolving details and moving this forward, and B, just considering what we do in the event that we can't get this resolved in time to drive that procurement and get all the, transmission, development, other lead time needs in place for that sort of post 2028 timeframe. And thanks
Nick.
again for fielding all of this.
No problem, Nick. It's part of the job. And thanks for some of that input. I think we'll eventually get back to folks. I don't want to say what form yet, but regarding, process steps from here. But Nick, you raise a good point about, well, can staff actually join outside conversations in the meantime to help, sharpen things? And, you can probably see me turning to my other computer here, taking notes, and that made it on. So thank you. Let's move to Michael. And if you've had your question answered, please do remember to lower your hand.
Hi, Michael Freeman, the Southern California Edison. Yeah, I just want to echo some of the comments that were made previously about in-person workshops, specifically in-person workshops where parties can present their own proposals and field questions from others and have an open dialogue. And I also do want to echo our appreciation for the proposals and all the work that's put into this. But yeah, I look forward to more workshops to come.
Thanks, Michael. Gabe.
Hey, this is Gabe Murtaugh from HydroStore. First of all, yes, I would agree with my other colleagues and certainly thank the commission and the commission staff for putting together this paper. We obviously appreciate that it's a very complex topic, and setting up a program like this, there are a lot of details that need to be worked out. So I think the 2-year gap between when we've last seen something written on this and now is understandable for trying to work out it and kind of hash through some of those discussions. And we certainly appreciate the time and effort that you've put into this meeting and hosting this meeting. During the meeting, I just would note that we've heard some comments like, hey, some of these existing programs are like a belt and suspenders approach. We've heard that some internal analysis indicates that results from I think it was RCPPP and RA wouldn't result in drastically different procurements. Maybe there is an opportunity here to take a step back and think about like holistically how this program or potential program that is developed from this process fits in with the other programs that are in place. And maybe there is an opportunity to reduce some of the regulatory burden and potentially maybe compile this program with another program. And I fully realize, what's gone in, the work that's gone into this to this point to get the proposal where it is. But maybe that's worth a discussion before we get into the details, just given some of the comments that have been talked about today. The other thing, I would certainly echo the other comments that have been made. In-person workshops, I think, would be enormously helpful. Likely, we're going to need more than one in-person workshop. I think, getting together and having the first workshop allows people to put in, kind of some opening positions, and then I think giving folks some time and let those ideas gel a little bit allows parties to come back and kind of more fully flesh out some of these ideas and how to execute on them. But would certainly encourage the commission and the commission staff to think about that. And I would echo those previous requests made by other colleagues. Thanks again.
Thanks for that, Gabe. On to Meredith.
On behalf of Microsoft, thank you again for the great workshop, and we were all really excited to see the proposal. Procedural suggestion on the workshops first. I'm neutral as to whether I think it would be better for the workshops to occur before or after written comment. I think there could be value both ways. If it's before, we can try to kind of consolidate directionally. Or after, I think people could really flesh out and ask each other more detailed questions and understand each other's positions. But looking longer term, just for those of us that represent customers, not regulated entities or generators, I I think we're always concerned about the amount of time it takes to participate. And I asked a question in the chat, but I didn't see an answer yet about looking longer term. Option 1 or option 2 would require a lot more process from the RA proceeding. And obviously, we will all be developing a really robust record here about the options and the relationship between what happens in the new procurement for reliability and RA. And so I'm curious if ALJ Fitch could answer, or others, how you envision kind of the transition from this phase into the RA proceeding so we can make it as efficient as possible. Thank you.
Good points, Meredith. Thank you. And yeah, that's especially from a former commission employee like yourself, to understand the added complexity that we're putting into the equation here by having big potential implications on multiple proceedings, serving things on multiple proceedings, does definitely add some sophistication to what we have to do here, but definitely not insurmountable in our opinion. So I think we just got some really good feedback on what to do process-wise. And what I'll propose to do is in the next week or two, for us to get back to parties with our thinking through some sort of means that will be obvious. I don't know if that would have to be proceeding level type interaction, like something formal from the judge. I think it maybe could actually be delegated to staff for some sort of service list email to provide everyone that was served this proposal some sort of clarity on process steps forthcoming. Simon, it looks like you have entered the queue. Just sent a request to unmute.
Everybody, Nathan, congratulations to staff on getting this staff proposal out. I know it's been a tremendous effort, and it's really trying to tackle the whole kit and caboodle of what we're trying to do here in California. So my commendations to staff. On behalf of NextEra, I do want to support the idea of having an in-person workshop. I think some form of dialogue, a better format for dialogue would be good. And I'm, here kind of brainstorming myself, thinking about how to be most helpful to have that be a well-structured and constructive forum. I do think that the parties can benefit from each other's analysis of the proposal and digesting it down and developing our questions, and trying to sort things from the perspective of different stakeholders. So for example, how are LSCs looking at this proposal, and what are they seeing in terms of the pros and cons of, say, option 1 versus option 2, or the CES proposal, and likewise, how are the developers seeing it? So I think that we can, those kind of different perspectives and groups can benefit from each other's own analysis and work in digesting the proposal. And if there's some way that we can kind of organize ourselves ahead of the workshop to share that kind of mind share, and then somehow kind of put that out there in some written form ahead of the workshop, I think that could be beneficial, so that we can just kind of see what the stakeholders are seeing from their perspectives in terms of pros and cons. Maybe even some kind of a SWOT analysis of what we're seeing in terms of the proposal, to just kind of lay the field of different perspectives that are out there. And I think that will help to narrow down the points that need to be kind of delved into in a subsequent workshop. Thanks again for the wonderful effort on this proposal.
And thanks for the feedback, Simon. I think we can take a lot of that on board to craft our next steps. Another thing that I probably should have made more clear in response to Meredith's question a minute ago is, at least the way we had preliminarily envisioned this is, it's an IRP-driven proposal. Yes, in tight coordination with RA and RPS, and would have implications for those proceedings and processes. But we were seeing potential, call it process or time savings on getting this done and stood up within IRP. And then if there are things that would flow into those other programs later, that would happen afterwards, that's a relatively natural order of operations. But if folks have reactions to that, especially for whatever next stakeholder engagement we do, I think that'd be helpful to hear people reflect on. And maybe what we can do when we do the outreach in the next week or two, where we try to clarify next process steps, we can actually have, you know, a list of similar topics of, you know, what we thought we heard and in terms of requires further discussion, and then maybe figure out a way to take you know, information from all of you on, you know, what do you think that maybe you didn't speak up about or didn't hear in the workshop that you think would be important, and we can figure out a way to apportion those and figure out a forum for them. So I think that covers us for process, and we've still got a little bit more time. Oh, okay. Michael, is this a process question? Let me unmute you.
Sorry. So Michael Colvin with Environmental Defense Fund. And we also were one of the parties who signed on to asking for a second workshop under other people's leadership. I think the question that I am sort of wrestling with right now is there's a lot of details, especially on the clean energy standard portion of the proposal, how some of these things would work on the zero emissions credits and some of the other things that we won't know how to be able to give good feedback to you all until we see a little bit more. There's a lot kind of to be defined. And so my suggestion is if there is a way that we could at least compile a list of here's sort of the broad questions that are still left to be unanswered, and then figure out how they're going to be developed, if it's going to be through the course of the proceeding, if it's going to be we're going to take the first step and adopt a clean energy standard, and then we will figure out, you know, the trading rules of zero emission credits, or we'll figure out you know, what percentage could be a credit only you know, trade versus this, what the timeline for Regis would be, et cetera, et cetera. If we could, you know, maybe just identify here the list is for the open questions and here's how we're going to deal with them. I think that would help me as a party, and I bet a bunch of others as a party then figure out, is this something that we can support, modify, make a different counter proposal to, et cetera. So that might be a useful next step.
Noted, Michael. We could take a look into that, but it's something that I would, consistent with my theme from framing remarks a little while ago of we just put a bunch of things in parties' inboxes. We do perceive it to be parties' turn to react. We can do what we can to help facilitate the next steps in the conversation, but I will remind others that in other proceedings, very often proposals are party generated and not staff generated, and staff has put in a ton of work to get things in your inboxes for you to react to. So we're happy to work together, but again, the theme for this next phase will be party input and not so much staff input. Mary?
Sorry, Nathan, just one thing to add on there is I think the concept of really having the brains trust in this room, stakeholders and staff and everyone think through fundamental design features versus critical, but, you know, further down the stream type matters to address. That's kind of part of what I'm hearing as well there. So as we raise questions and issues with design, helping to lift up what are the, those kind of fundamental versus later on topics would really help stakeholders and staff.
So let's move to Mary Neal. Mary, you should be unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, Mary, this is representing ARM. I just have a process question. Apologies if it was already discussed, but I know you're requesting party feedback here in these comments, but then what happens? Are we going to do a formal ruling with more comments or going straight to a PD, or do we know?
TBD, Mary. If we do these next few weeks and months right, so you know, whatever other process we need, and if we get great comment and we can all, kind of crystallize towards something that can go into a PD, I think everyone would benefit from getting things into a PD. But if we go through these next few weeks and months and realize, hey, we're not there yet, we're not going to force things into a PD, if that answers your question.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay, any more folks with process questions? And if you've had your question answered, please lower your hand. But any more process questions? Okay. Hearing none, we will try to get back to this group within a week or two with next steps on that. We do have some time left, so I think in a couple places, similar to how we dealt with the ELCC versus slice of day question during or right after that first intermission, I think we could try to verbalize a couple of the other kind of tougher nuts to crack that we've seen in the Q&A. One comes to mind regarding counting of things like Diablo and how that would relate to the proposal here. I'll stick with the theme of we really want to hear party reactions on this, as well as just about everything else. But counting nuclear and in particular Diablo is a knotty question, not as in tough knot to untie, where on one hand we've got SB 846 from a few years ago that has language that directs us to plan and I think procure as if Diablo is not there. And so that puts some limits on what we think statutorily we're allowed to do in terms of portfolios that we adopt in IRP and maybe that we procure to. But given other developments since then, because it has been almost 3 years since that bill, should we be thinking about things differently? And should it count towards RCPPP? And what's the relationship between it counting an RA and whether it can count here? And then should its GHG free energy count towards the program or not? Regardless of what you see in the proposal, we really would like to hear reflections on that because it's not an easy discussion, or I should say it's not an easy problem, though we do hope to have a discussion all the way up to legislative level if that's necessary. Say if we need statutory clarification on what we can and can't do with something like Diablo. Now, at this point, I'll actually put things to panelists. Are there any other topics that you think you wanted to cover? I can cover one more right now, but if you have something that you feel like would benefit from a little bit of verbalization, please do feel free to step in. The other thing that I've seen in Q&A is, hey, thanks for designing this new RCPPP thing and putting it in a proposal, but does that mean that you're just going to layer on a whole new set of requirements for all LSCs to submit at some regular cadence on top of what we already have to submit for IRP, both twice yearly for the compliance information and then monthly for other procurement information, and then RPS, and then RA, and then in other places? Commission, are you sure you can't find some more efficiency in your filings in order to make this easier on everybody? And I think whether it's clearly stated in the proposal or not, we really do hope to find some efficiencies in filings and things like that. That might be second order for a lot of you. I think most of the questions that we're seeing in the chat are more technical and policy about, hey, how are you going to implement this thing? And what are the counting rules going to be, et cetera. Those are very substantive, but I do think it's worth raising. It's a non-trivial matter of, for us to be providing good government, so to speak. I think it's incumbent on us to also look for efficiencies. So thanks to Jem and some others that put in the Q&A kind of a question, but also a prompt to us like, hey, can you please look for some efficiencies to make life a little bit more streamlined? The answer is yes, and we're completely all ears on ways to do that. Now, to my fellow panelists, anything else that you would want to see verbalized before we close?
Yeah, hi folks. I mean, there are a few questions around to what extent can RCPPP help or interact with the, I'm thinking of the interconnection process and the role that LSCs play in in their actions, either through assigning points to prioritize study of projects or demonstrating that they've got, or the developers demonstrating that they've got a PPA to advance their applications in the queue. So I think, I guess I just offer one quick response and would like to give it more thought and perhaps hear from follow-up questions from folks who want to do that verbally. But, I think clearly there are enormous challenges at the moment with bringing resources online regarding interconnection problems, right? And so we've got the interconnection process enhancement initiative from the CAISO, trying to help that and getting better alignment with IRP and transmission planning. But yeah, there's a clear role for procurement signals here. And so RCPPP, in my view, can only help that. So I think the questions folks are asking here are great questions to be asking in the absence of RCPPP anyway. I think my answer is let's get RCPPP in place ASAP to address your points. But if there are some specific kind of design features of RCPPP you can suggest that respect, the respective roles of the CAISO and the CPUC on interconnection and resource procurement, that would help it to have, verbally. Well, sorry, I guess perhaps you could verbally just rephrase your questions to help us respond here, and then obviously in comments you could be sharing your ideas on design features to get at what I was trying to phrase there.
So Michael, I think your hand might still be up from earlier. I'm going to go to Hillary. Please message me if you do have a new question. Hillary?
Hi, Hillary Bear. I think I asked some of those questions about alignment with CAISO and some of those processes. So yeah, just things I'm thinking about and would be happy to talk more about in workshops would be, the timing of need assessment flowing into solicitations and PPA negotiations, and having that information, LSEs being able to have that information, having gone through their solicitations and shortlisting processes in time to get their LSE points to CAISO. It's like just thinking a little bit about what information LSEs will have at the time that they, and if will they have it at the time that they need it to provide those points to CAISO? And then similarly, for deliverability results, when will those happen at CAISO, and is that happening at the right time for LSEs to be making decisions? So that's one of the areas I've been thinking about. And then I think I already said in the written chat, but also just thinking about the very specific nature of the deliverability reservations at CAISO and just how that interacts with the procurement obligations here. But yeah, definitely still thinking through those issues, but didn't see much of that in the proposal. So wondered if it was just out of scope or if there's just a lot to think through.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hillary. Molly may have a response there. I've got one thought to add after Molly.
No, actually, you go. Mine's a different point. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, Hillary, I guess what I was trying to say is RCPPP can only help give the signals for procurement that's needed, in my view. So no, the proposal doesn't go into the detail of will RCPPP timing of adoption be in time to address specific milestones in the interconnection process. I think we're too far from being clear on the adoption timeline to do that. So yeah, in your comments, perhaps please flag where maybe that could be done, or if you're getting at design features about the cadence of RCPPP in its cycle and how that would align with future interconnection study cycles, that would really, I think, address what you're doing there. Thanks. So I think back to Molly.
Nathan, am I okay to comment on? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see so many of you have joined today, and thank you for your questions, comments, and thanks to the staff for leading this today. Really exciting milestone where we are. I just want to put in a kind of a big picture plug of where I think we are and where we could get to this year. I know I heard a question a few moments ago about, like, can we go to PD? Can we not go to PD? So where we are is we have this proposal to move to a programmatic approach for both reliability and clean procurement. And the reliability option has two options, and Sina went through them a bunch, and there are really strong pros and cons to both. But if we don't move forward on going to at least a programmatic approach, given where we are in terms of timing, I do expect we will have to put development of a programmatic approach on hold and kind of divert resources to looking at another order approach, which has a lot of downsides because it doesn't allow for load migration, and it doesn't allow for it doesn't allow for us to switch both our internal and our external thinking towards how to do this kind of like consolidation and routinization. Like, we can only do so many things at once. We can either kind of work towards building this program approach, or we can kind of put that on hold and go back to another order approach. So although there are hundreds of questions in the chat and there are loads of details, as we move forward in comments and in talking with each other, I would ask you to try to see if there is a consensus, at least, that we need to move forward with a programmatic approach, and perhaps on option 1 and 2, in the recognition that things like, should there be a 1.5% buffer or a 2.5% buffer, or should it be T+0 in June, or should it be in July? I mean, all of those things are kinds of those kinds of details about, filing consolidation, or, many of those things. They're such good questions. But if we start talking amongst ourselves about how confusing all the details are and how much we need to work out and how we need to do a lot of side proposals, I don't know that we'll be able to get to the point where we need to at least drive forward on what I would call is, sometimes the commission calls these like an interim decision, that we're going forward with this. And I would harken back to, on the slice of day side with RA, there was a decision that said, we're going forward with this, staff go work on some of these details. I wouldn't be surprised, there's always going to be more details to work on. If you're familiar with the RA program, there is literally an annual program modification decision, each year to kind of refine the program, and done it for nearly 20 years. And so, things, if this goes forward, there's going to have to be iterative development over time. So I just wanted to put in a plea for, I hear the process questions and stuff, and I think I really appreciated all of those comments, and I don't think anyone was necessarily not getting my point, but I just wanted to make sure I verbalized that with folks, that even though there's a lot of details here, I do think that the large amount of us, we can probably get to a consensus. I still am hopeful that we can get to a consensus to move forward with some version of this proposal, and with stakeholder input, it can be even stronger. And so we're just trying to strike that balance between, how much do you figure out now versus how much you kick out later, and that's something that we regularly have to contend with at the commission. So thanks. That's my input. And if anyone has questions about how we do that or suggestions, bring them on. Thanks.
Thanks, Molly. Let's head to Simon.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, Simon Baker for NextEra, and this goes to your questions and discussion around the connection with interconnection. We did put a question in chat about this. And it really goes to cluster 14, which we think is probably best positioned to fill that procurement gap post 2028. And the particular situation there is that cluster 14 is threatened by lack of LSC contracting post 2028 because projects that receive deliverability in 2024, they have like a August 2025 deadline per the CAISO tariff. And so if there's kind of uncertainty about when the RCPPP proposal would be adopted by the commission, that's subject to kind of creating a situation where there's, you know, kind of a pause on LSC contracting. So our understanding is that this proposal is intended to kind of solve that, and it may just be that, you know, this just needs to move forward, and that's just a gap that needs to be solved in some other kind of way through coordination with the CAISO, and that's fine. You know, we have a we have a system in California where the agencies have to work really closely together and stay in their swim lanes, and this might be a part where it's really the CAISO swim lane. But just want to ensure that there's an acknowledgement there, or if, you know, we, the developer community, are not looking at that, or if the agencies are seeing that that's not a problem and that there's another way to fix that, we'd love to hear that. But just want to kind of put that out there, which we think is kind of a little bit of an elephant in the room, and problem needing to be solved somehow to be able to make this whole thing work.
It's a great point, Simon. And I think it's consistent with Molly's main point of how are we looking at the relationship between perfect and possibly it being the enemy of good in terms of timeline and whether to adopt something versus spend a lot more time trying to adopt something perfect. If you could adopt something that is good, and then, like Molly said, maybe have something similar to what the RA programs had for almost 20 years, which is ongoing refinements that happen every year. And, you know, that to me, that seems like a healthy way to have a program. You would want on-ramps for new information and chances for the program to evolve over time to adapt to a changing world. Let's go to Nick.
Hey, thanks, Nathan. Nick Pappas for ACP California. Just a couple thoughts on process. I think Simon's comments really tee up the urgency and, you know, expand on some of the urgency I spoke to previously. I guess I just wanted to think a little bit through out loud and get your reaction to the idea of the timing and the viability of getting something implemented in time to address some of the concerns Simon raised and the sort of broader need for reliability and clean energy procurement in the maybe near to midterm, depending on how you define that. I think it's fair to say that the reliability frameworks, while both options are fairly substantive moves, option one seems to envision a larger transition away to this sort of elegant, all-in new world of RA and marginal ELCC that probably has a fair amount of details to work through to get implemented. And then beyond that, for LSCs to all figure out how to find that perfectly economically efficient solution with marginal ELCC and do contracting accordingly. Whereas option two, at least as I understand it, feels fairly similar to MTR with some modifications, or at least closer to MTR. So the theme that I want to bring up on process here is there are some gates that, you know, Molly referred to around deciding whether this is going forward smoothly and quickly versus, you know, going to take years of development. And I think I would be interested in your collective take on whether we have a faster path to move forward with something actionable to start getting contracts and steel on the ground under something that looks more like, you know, RA plus an extension of MTR, which I think is roughly option two with some modifications, versus a, you know, very elegant large scale transition. And I think making that determination early, you know, in RA, it took us about a year to debate, maybe 2 years to debate the initial framing of, are we doing slice of day or not? I don't think we have the luxury of that time here. But that gate of, are we going with a big elegant shift to this like all-in market-based framework in option one, or are we extending to procurement orders in option two, is a really critical decision point on whether some near-term action needs to take place to get these near-term contracts and development executed.
Nick, good points. Let me try to address, maybe not in sequence, the questions that you embedded there. First, actually, I'll try to take the toughest one last, which is how much time do we perceive ourselves to have? Not in order. The other ones, I think you're asking if we were to adopt something like 2, which you perceive to be more readily implementable than 1, at least in terms of time frame, does that preclude us moving eventually towards something that's more 1-like? And my opinion is no, that we wouldn't be precluded by making a choice between 1 and 2 from what we could do after that choice, i.e. could we move back towards the other option if the first choice we made wasn't working out? Would that be optimal from a process and kind of administrative cost perspective? Maybe not. But I wouldn't say that the door is necessarily closed if we end up choosing an option that isn't actually going to stick long term in terms of reliability. On timeline, I think there's a couple questions that would have to be answered before we got to a response to how much time do we have. So if I can be really coarse about it and say, well, the next year that we know we need to set requirements for is definitely 2029, if not earlier, but let's just say 2029. If we pivoted, a large chunk of IRP's resources now to doing another procurement order like we've done before, and establishing on the record that would need to be established, when could that order be adopted, and would that be enough lead time for resources to come online? I think it's May, so I think something could be adopted in 2026 if we needed that, and that that would provide for, I don't know, 2.5, 3 years worth of lead time, which LSCs have responded to in the past successfully. A couple of the orders we've done in the past have had less than 24 months worth of lead time before the first procurement gate. And while some of it, that procurement was certainly tough on some folks, a lot of it happened successfully. And we're not necessarily looking to put people through that ringer again. If it's what the system needs, I mean, it's an option we'd have to look at. But that whole hypothetical does depend on some other key assumptions, like us redirecting a ton of resources of IRPs right now to developing record and vetting, et cetera, what we would need to get another procurement order in place. So at least personally, I was hoping to get through this phase of stakeholdering. So this workshop and whatever might be coming next, and then comments and replies, and then taking a long, hard look at our options to see then if we start developing some other sort of path, say for another one-off procurement order, if that's what has to happen in order to keep things moving. And that might also kind of satiate some of the issues that say Simon was raising regarding clusters, et cetera. If there's just another procurement signal, whether it's RCPPP or not, that is needed by the market. But like Molly said, doing that, that being creating the record for another procurement order is very substantive in terms of time, workload, et cetera. And so we're looking to avoid it if we can. Let's go to Michael.
Nathan, I'll just add on, just reflecting Nick's comment, which was really a comment, but I think it does go to the question of timing. But I think option 1, timeline, implementation timeline versus option 2 in reliability. I think that was like very much a new resource development perspective, and existing resource owners might see option 1 as more implementable in terms of timeline. They're already considering the issues involved there. So yeah, I would just encourage parties to form their own views on which one would be quicker to implement. And then related to like just the broader question of waiting on adoption, you know, I think the context of IRP, and as Nate teed up at the beginning, like the planning track has been running for years, and you know, many folks can see that take let's say any plans as an indication of what will be procured, and yes, the one-off orders have somewhat got LSEs waiting what comes next, but in the spirit of the planning, and then hopefully what you're seeing with RCPPP, almost any procurement is going to be helpful, and waiting for the exact details is not going to help the state transition. But I don't want to be naive to the investment cases that need to be run, and how important exact compliance requirements can be. But yeah, we've got to work together on this to not have not wait forever, as Molly was getting at.
Yeah. Can I also just chime in and say, when people are thinking about the timing of the proceeding, including any future workshops and things like that, think about that when you're looking at slide 56 in the workshop deck, and it talks about the February IRP system portfolio adoption, and then that would trigger the release of the RCPPP need and ELCCs, and with an April proposed release of need allocation. So that would be, 11 months from now, we would propose that LSEs would receive their first need allocation, and then in December 2026, you would have your first showing. So if we, comments come in July, and if we want to release, that type of information by February, we'd obviously have to adopt something between those two dates. Anything that we delay beyond, the longer we delay, the less likely it is that you could start something in 2026 and align it with the existing IRP planning cycle. You probably have to wait a year. Nathan or Sina, does that align with your thinking? Okay.
It does.
I just wanted to connect the dots. Thanks.
So let's go to Michael.
Michael Kiros, Ava Community Energy. Thank you so much for hosting this workshop. It's really great to hear all the thinking that your team has done to create this proposal. I know it's been a long road. Molly, I think your threshold question on whether or not parties can align behind a programmatic approach is a great place to start. I can absolutely appreciate the limitations of the order-by-order approach and the potential benefits of a programmatic approach. But I'd also like to echo the comments regarding taking a holistic view of RCPPP within the landscape of existing programs and trying to streamline both resource accounting methodologies and compliance requirements where possible. That's pretty important to Ava for moving forwards with this new paradigm, and I'm definitely glad to hear that's on the CPUC's radar. I hear that you're looking for feedback from parties, and I think we'd be happy to come back with some more pointed thoughts on how that could be achieved. But yeah, all in all, thanks a bunch for putting this on.
Thanks, Michael. Likewise. Let's go to Shauna.
Hi, Shauna Lazaro, California Environmental Justice Alliance. I appreciate the reminder of the slice of day process in RA, where it has also a party and has been going through that slice of day transition process. I feel like the difference here, and looking at the fundamental design issues, is that here we're talking about designing a procurement program that has specific attributes that it has to include, and things like locational targeting, air quality, that are just missing. And so I feel like adding them on as new nodes later on and adjusting or tweaking or moving toward slightly different angles, really, like, I don't think that we can fix a new procurement program to add some of the fundamental things that it needed to do from the start that are going to affect every other piece of it. And I think if we don't wind up in a mass-based approach on GHGs, that might go into the same bucket of like, we're designing something that is actually not going to be fixable. That comes from, FEHA has been very supportive of taking a program, like we definitely believe we need a programmatic approach to procurement. So it's coming from that place of love and support. And also, like, there's some very big things missing.
Shauna, thanks for all that input. Would be happy to talk with you on the side or in future stakeholder engagement about your perceptions of what statutorily requirements are on this program. But we'd be happy to work through that, and thanks for the input. Any other questions from the audience? You can use the raise your hand function. And if you're on the phone and have been starved of the raise your hand function because it's not apparent from your handset, I think you can use *6. Okay. Seeing no more, I think 3 hours and 15 minutes of discussing RCPPP was enough for one day, even though we have budgeted until 1 p.m. That was pretty dense for everybody. So let us thank you again for a tremendous amount of good input and hopefully more to come. As a reminder, in the next week or two, we will be sending something out to the relevant service lists regarding guidance for future process. Yeah, thanks to the panelists, the presenters. I hope today was very, very informative for everybody. We look forward to more convening on this and getting to something that works. As you know, to Molly's point, we're seeing a lot of things in Q&A regarding details, implementation, which is a good sign. Yes, they are not that we have to work through, but we're not seeing a whole lot in terms of kind of existential, like, hey, don't even do a program, which is a really big step. So thanks to everyone, and we'll be talking to you soon.